The archive room in the Cleveland field office smelled like dust and old paper, the kind of smell that settles into your clothes and follows you home. Special Agent Thaddeus Keene stood in the doorway, looking at rows of filing cabinets that stretched back into shadows the fluorescent lights couldn't quite reach. It was February, and outside the windows, the sky hung low and gray over the city, pressing down like something heavy. Keene had been with the Bureau for 17 years, most of them spent in fraud and white-collar cases, but 3 months ago he'd been reassigned to the cold case unit. The work was different, slower. You spent your days with ghosts, piecing together stories that had gone cold decades before you ever heard about them. Most of the time, the answers you found didn't bring anyone peace. They just closed files. His partner, Special Agent Mara Tully, walked past him into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was younger than Keene by about 10 years, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of sharp eyes that noticed everything. She'd transferred from the Detroit office 6 weeks ago, and Keene was still getting used to working with someone again. "Records clerk said the file's in cabinet 42, Tully said, handing him one of the coffees. "Third drawer down. Case number 91 CL4478. Keene took the coffee and followed her into the archive room. Their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor. The ceiling was high, and somewhere in the darkness above them, old pipes dripped condensation onto the cement. It was cold down here, the kind of cold that worked its way into your bones. They found cabinet 42 near the back wall. Tully pulled open the 3rd drawer, and her fingers walked through the hanging folders until she found the right one. She lifted it out and set it on top of the cabinet. The folder was thick, bulging with papers that had yellowed with age. "Case from 91, Tully said, flipping it open. "Rust Belt serial murders. 3 victims over 18 months, all women in their 20s. Suspect was a machine operator at a steel plant in Youngstown. Name was Leonard Barch." Keene looked over her shoulder at the crime scene photos. Black and white images, grainy and faded. The victims had been found in abandoned industrial buildings, each one posed in the same way. The details were brutal, and Keene didn't let his eyes linger on them. "Barch confessed to all 3, Tully continued. Gave a full statement on tape. But before trial, he recanted everything. Said the confession was coerced. His public defender argued police misconduct and the case fell apart. Barch walked. And now someone's reopening it," Keene said. "DA's office got new DNA evidence," Tully said. "Technology's better now. They want to match it against the original confession tape. See if Barch mentioned details that only the killer would know. Physical evidence that matches what he said back then could corroborate the DNA and put him away." Keene nodded. It made sense. Cold cases got reopened all the time when new technology offered fresh angles. But there was something else, something Tully wasn't saying yet. "So, what's the problem?" Keene asked. Tully looked at him. "The problem is the tape's missing." The Cleveland field office had been built in 1978, a concrete block of a building with narrow windows and floors that seemed to go on forever. The evidence storage was in the basement, 3 floors below ground level, and that's where Keene and Tully went next. They took the elevator down, and when the doors opened, they were greeted by a records clerk named August Rook. Rook was in his 60s, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that had seen better days. He'd worked for the Bureau for over 30 years, most of it in records management. He was the kind of person who remembered where everything was supposed to be, even if it wasn't there anymore. "Agents," Rook said, nodding at them. He had a clipboard in one hand and a pen behind his ear. "I pulled what I could find on the Barch case. Followed the chain of custody back as far as the records go." "And?" Tully asked. "The confession tape was logged into evidence in November of 1991, Rook said. Original cassette, standard microcassette format. It was stored here until 1984, when it was checked out for the appeals hearing. After that, it should have been returned, but there's no record of it coming back. Keene frowned. No record at all? Nothing, Rook said. I went through the logs twice. The tape left in '94, and that's the last anyone wrote about it. They followed Rook through the storage area, past rows of metal shelving units loaded with boxes and evidence bags. Everything was labeled, cataloged, organized by case number and date. The air smelled like cardboard and plastic and something faintly chemical, like old adhesive breaking down. Rook stopped in front of a shelf and pointed to a box marked with the case number. This is everything we have. Physical evidence from the crime scenes, photos, witness statements, but no tape. Tully lifted the box down and set it on a nearby table. She opened it and started going through the contents. Keene watched her work, his mind already trying to put the pieces together. A missing confession tape wasn't unusual by itself. Evidence got misplaced, misfiled, sometimes destroyed by accident. But something about this case felt off. Who checked it out in '94? Keene asked. Rook consulted his clipboard. Assistant U.S. Attorney named Richard Kelso. He was handling Barch's appeal. But Kelso retired in 2003, moved to Florida. I called him yesterday and he said he returned the tape after the hearing. Remembers putting it back in the evidence envelope himself. Then where did it go? Tully said, not looking up from the box. Nobody answered. The three of them stood there in the fluorescent light, surrounded by shelves full of forgotten evidence, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Keene and Tully spent the rest of the afternoon going through the Barch file, reading old police reports and witness statements. The case was brutal in the way that old cases sometimes were. The details had a weight to them, a heaviness that settled in your chest and didn't leave. Leonard Barch had worked at the Youngstown steel plant for 12 years before the murders started. He was quiet, kept to himself, never caused any trouble. His co-workers described him as polite but distant, the kind of man you'd forget about as soon as he left the room. He lived alone in a small house on the east side of town, and nobody ever saw him with friends or family. The first victim was a waitress named Angela Drummond. She disappeared on a Saturday night in March of 1990 after finishing her shift at a diner on Market Street. Her body was found 3 days later in an abandoned factory building on the south side. She'd been strangled, posed on the floor with her hands crossed over her chest. There were no signs of sexual assault, no obvious motive. Just a young woman killed and left in the dark. The second victim was a college student named Marie Vickers. She vanished in August of the same year, taken from a parking lot near her apartment. Her body turned up in another abandoned building, posed the same way. Same cause of death, same lack of physical evidence. The police started connecting the cases, looking for patterns. The third victim was a grocery store clerk named Teresa Wick. October 1991. Same pattern, same method, same empty buildings. By that time, the Youngstown PD had formed a task force, and the FBI had been called in to assist. It was a big case, the kind that drew media attention and political pressure. Barch became a suspect after a witness reported seeing his car near the parking lot where Marie Vickers disappeared. Police brought him in for questioning, and after 8 hours in an interview room, he confessed to all 3 murders. He gave details that matched the crime scenes, details that hadn't been released to the public. He signed a written statement and sat for a recorded confession, his voice flat and emotionless as he described what he'd done. But then, 2 weeks later, he recanted. Said the police had threatened him, coerced him, kept him in that room until he said what they wanted to hear. His lawyer filed a motion to suppress the confession, and without it, the prosecution's case crumbled. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no confession. Barch walked out of the courthouse a free man. Keene closed the file and rubbed his eyes. It was after 6 in the evening and the office was mostly empty. Across the desk, Tully was reading through the transcript of Barch's confession, her face expressionless. "What are you thinking?" Keene asked. Tully looked up. "I'm thinking the tape is the only thing that matters. If we can find it, we can compare what Barch said to the new DNA evidence. If he described details that match, that corroborates his guilt. But without the tape, we've got nothing. So where do we look?" Tully leaned back in her chair. "Rook said the tape was checked out in '94 for the appeals hearing. That hearing was held at the Northern District Courthouse in downtown Cleveland. Maybe someone there remembers something." Keene nodded. It was a long shot, but long shots were all they had right now. They drove to the courthouse the next morning. It was an old building, granite and limestone, built in the 1920s when Cleveland was still a booming industrial city. Inside, the hallways were wide and echoed with footsteps. The air smelled like floor wax and old wood. The courthouse records office was on the 3rd floor, a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and boxes. A clerk named Helen something or other helped them search through the case files from 1994, but there was nothing about the confession tape. No notes, no logs, no indication that anyone had even listened to it during the hearing. Kelso said he returned it, Tully said as they left the courthouse. But if it's not in evidence storage and it's not here, then where? Keene didn't have an answer. They stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the city. The sky was still gray, and a cold wind blew trash down the sidewalk. "There's one other place we can check," Keene said. "The old Youngstown field office." Tully looked at him. "Youngstown closed down in 2006. "I know, but the evidence from local cases was supposed to be transferred to Cleveland when they shut it down. Maybe the tape got left behind, or misfiled, or ended up in the wrong box. It wasn't a great theory, but it was something." Tully nodded, and they got back in the car. The drive to Youngstown took just over an hour. The city had been dying for decades, ever since the steel industry collapsed in the 1970s. Whole neighborhoods were abandoned now, streets lined with empty houses and boarded-up storefronts. The old FBI field office was on the north side, a 2-story brick building that had been vacant for almost 20 years. Keene parked in front of the building, and they sat there for a moment, looking at it. The windows were covered with plywood, and graffiti covered the walls. The door hung loose on its hinges, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. "This place looks like it's been forgotten," Tully said. "That's what happens," Keene said. He opened his door and stepped out. They crossed the parking lot and pushed open the front door. Inside, the building was dark and smelled like mold and rot. The floor was littered with broken glass and old papers, and somewhere in the darkness water dripped steadily onto concrete. Keene turned on his flashlight and swept the beam across the empty lobby. The walls were stained with water damage, and the ceiling sagged in places. Tully turned on her own flashlight, and together they moved deeper into the building. The evidence storage room was in the basement, down a narrow staircase that creaked under their weight. The air got colder as they descended, and the smell of mold got stronger. At the bottom of the stairs they found a metal door standing half open. Keene pushed it open the rest of the way, and they stepped inside. The room was large, lined with metal shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Most of the shelves were empty now, but a few still held boxes and evidence bags, left behind when the office closed. They started searching, going through the boxes one by one. Most of them were labeled with case numbers from the 1990s and early 2000s, long closed investigations that nobody cared about anymore. Dust covered everything, and the air was thick and hard to breathe. It took them almost 2 hours to search the room, and they didn't find the confession tape. But they found something else. In the back corner of the room, on the bottom shelf, there was a box marked with the Barch case number. Keene pulled it out and set it on the floor. Inside were old case files, crime scene photos, evidence logs, and at the bottom, wrapped in plastic, was a microcassette tape. Tully knelt down beside him. "Is that it?" Keene lifted the tape out of the box. It was in a clear plastic evidence bag, labeled with the case number and the date, November 1991. He held it up to the light from his flashlight, and through the plastic he could see the tape reels inside the cassette. "This is it," Keene said. They took the tape back to Cleveland and logged it into evidence. The next step was to listen to it, to hear Leonard Barch's confession in his own words and compare it to the new DNA evidence. But when they tried to play the tape on a microcassette player in the tech lab, they ran into a problem. The tape was degraded. 30 years in storage, sitting in a damp basement, had damaged the magnetic coating. The tech, a young woman with short hair and tired eyes, worked on it for almost an hour, trying different players and cleaning the tape heads, but the sound quality was terrible. The voice on the tape was muffled, broken up by static and dropouts. "I can try to clean it up digitally," the tech said, "but it's going to take time, a few days, maybe more." Keene nodded. "Do what you can." They left the tech lab and went back to Keene's desk. It was late afternoon, and the office was quiet. Tully sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Something about this doesn't feel right," Tully said finally. Keene looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The tape was missing from evidence storage, but we found it in Youngstown," Tully said. "That doesn't make sense. If it was transferred when the office closed, it should have ended up in Cleveland with everything else. But it didn't. It was just sitting there, in an abandoned building, like someone forgot about it. Or like someone left it there on purpose," Keene said. Tully frowned. Why would anyone do that? Keene didn't answer. He was thinking about the way the box had been sitting on that bottom shelf, tucked away in the corner, like someone had hidden it. 3 days later, the tech called them back to the lab. She'd managed to clean up the audio, running it through filters to reduce the static and enhance the voice. It still wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to understand what was being said. Keene and Tully sat in the lab and listened to the tape. The voice on the recording was flat, emotionless, just like the transcript had described. Leonard Barch talked about the murders in a detached way, like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. He gave details about the victims, about where he'd found them and how he'd killed them. He described the abandoned buildings, the way he'd posed the bodies, the tools he'd used. But as they listened, Keene started to notice something strange. There were moments when Barch's voice seemed to overlap with itself, like two recordings playing at the same time. The words were the same, but the timing was slightly off, creating an echo effect that made the voice sound hollow and distorted. "Did you hear that?" Keene asked, pausing the tape. "The echo," Tully said. "Yeah, I thought it was just the degradation." The tech shook her head. "That's not degradation. That's a recording artifact. It happens when you record over an existing tape, or when you splice two recordings together." Keene and Tully looked at each other. "Someone edited this tape?" Tully asked. "Maybe," the tech said. "Or it could be a technical glitch from the original recording equipment. Hard to say without analyzing it more closely." They listened to the rest of the tape, and the echo effect appeared several more times, always in the same sections where Barch was describing specific details about the crimes. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but once Keene heard it, he couldn't unhear it. When the tape ended, Keene sat back in his chair and stared at the player. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. If someone edited this tape, Tully said slowly, that means the confession might not be authentic. Or it means someone added details that weren't in the original, Keene said. Details that would make the confession more convincing. The tech looked uncomfortable. You'd need a forensic audio analyst to confirm that. I can send the file to Quantico, but it's going to take time. Keene nodded. Do it. They left the lab and walked back through the office in silence. Keene's head was full of questions. If the tape had been edited, who did it, and why? Was someone trying to frame Leonard Barch, or was there something else going on? They reached Keene's desk, and Tully sat down heavily in her chair. This case just got a lot more complicated, she said. Keene didn't disagree. That night, Keene couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of traffic outside his apartment window. He kept thinking about the tape, about that strange echo in Leonard Barch's voice, about the box sitting on that shelf in Youngstown, waiting to be found. Around 2 a.m, he gave up on sleep and got out of bed. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with the Barch case file spread out in front of him. He read through the old police reports again, looking for anything he might have missed. There was a witness statement from a man who'd lived near one of the abandoned buildings where a victim was found. The man said he'd seen someone leaving the building late at night, but he couldn't describe them. Just a figure in the darkness, walking away. There was another statement from a woman who worked at the steel plant with Leonard Barch. She said Barch was a strange man, quiet and withdrawn, but she also said he'd been at work the night one of the victims disappeared, clocked in for a double shift. The statement was buried in the file, never brought up at trial. Keene closed the file and drank his coffee. The more he looked at this case, the more wrong it felt. His phone buzzed on the table. A text message from Tully. Can't sleep either. Want to meet? Keene texted back. Where? Office. 20 minutes. The Cleveland field office was different at night. The fluorescent lights hummed louder in the empty hallways, and every small sound seemed amplified in the silence. Keene met Tully in the cold case unit, a warren of desks and filing cabinets on the 4th floor. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at her desk with her laptop open and papers spread out around her. Couldn't stop thinking about the tape, Tully said, as Keene sat down across from her. That echo, the way his voice overlapped with itself. Me neither, Keene said. He noticed she'd pulled up the audio file on her computer, the waveform displayed across the screen in jagged peaks and valleys. Tully pointed at the screen. I've been going through it again, listening to the sections where the echo appears. It's always when Barch is describing specific details, the location of the bodies, the positioning, the timeline. Never during the general confession parts, just the details. Keene leaned forward, studying the waveform. Like someone wanted to make sure those details were clear. Make them stand out. Or make them up, Tully said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the implications of what she'd said settling over them like a weight. If the tape had been deliberately altered, if someone had added or changed Barch's words, then everything about the original case was suspect. The confession that had briefly put Barch away, the confession that had fallen apart on appeal, might have been manufactured. We need to talk to Barch, Keene said. Tully nodded. I already looked him up. He's still in Youngstown. Still lives in the same house he had back in '91. Tomorrow morning, Keene said, we go talk to him. The drive to Youngstown the next day felt longer than it had before. The gray sky pressed down on them, and a light rain started to fall as they crossed into the city limits. Keene watched the street slide past the window, block after block of empty buildings and vacant lots. This place felt like a wound that had never healed. Leonard Barch's house was on the east side, a small ranch-style place with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The gutters sagged, and one of the front windows was covered with plastic sheeting. An old pickup truck sat in the driveway, rusted and covered in grime. Keene and Tully got out of the car and walked up the cracked sidewalk to the front door. Keene knocked, and they waited. After a moment, they heard footsteps inside, slow and heavy. The door opened. Leonard Barch was in his 60s now, a thin man with gray hair and a lined face. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt, and his eyes were cautious as he looked at them through the screen door. "Mr. Barch?" Keene said, holding up his credentials. "Special Agent Keene, FBI. This is Special Agent Tully. We'd like to talk to you about your case from 91. Barch's expression didn't change. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at them, and then he pushed open the screen door. "Come in," he said. The inside of the house was cluttered and dim. The living room was filled with old furniture and stacks of newspapers, and the air smelled like cigarette smoke and something stale. Barch led them to a small kitchen table and gestured for them to sit. He remained standing, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "You're reopening the case," Barch said. It wasn't a question. "New evidence has come to light," Keene said carefully. "DNA evidence that wasn't available in 91. The district attorney wants to review your confession." Barch's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill those women." "You confessed to it," Tully said. "In detail." "I was in that room for 8 hours, Barch said, his voice hard. "No lawyer, no food, no water. They told me if I didn't confess, I'd get the death penalty. They said they'd make sure I never saw daylight again. So I told them what they wanted to hear." Keene pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the table. "We found the original confession tape. We'd like you to listen to it." Barch stared at the recorder like it was a snake. "I don't need to hear it. I know what I said." "Please," Tully said. "It's important." After a long moment, Barch nodded. Keene pressed play. Leonard Barch's voice filled the small kitchen, flat and emotionless, describing the murders in clinical detail. Keene watched Barch's face as he listened. The man's expression was hard to read. His eyes fixed on the recorder, his jaw clenched. Then the echo started. That strange overlapping of voice, the words repeating themselves with a slight delay. Barch's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" he asked. "We were hoping you could tell us," Keene said. Barch shook his head slowly. "That's not how it sounded. When they recorded me, there wasn't any echo. It was just my voice, clear, not like that." Tully leaned forward. "Are you saying this tape has been altered?" "I'm saying that's not what I remember," Barch said. "And some of those details, the way the voice is describing the locations, the positioning of the bodies, I never said it like that. They told me what to say, where the bodies were found, how they were posed. I repeated it back, but not like that, not with all those specifics." Keene and Tully exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Keene asked. "I mean, they fed me information," Barch said. "Detective named Hargrove. He'd describe a crime scene, tell me what they found, and then he'd turn on the recorder and tell me to say it. But some of what's on that tape I never said. Or I said it different." Keene felt a chill run through him. "Are you telling us the police fabricated parts of your confession?" "I'm telling you I was coerced," Barch said. And now you're playing me a tape that doesn't even sound right, asking me about murders I didn't commit. So, yeah, maybe someone messed with it. I wouldn't put anything past them." They talked with Barch for another hour, going through his story step by step. He maintained his innocence, insisting that the confession had been forced. He described the interrogation in detail. The small room, the two detectives, the way they'd worn him down hour by hour until he couldn't think straight anymore. When they left Barch's house, the rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray and heavy. Keene and Tully sat in the car for a moment, neither of them speaking. "Do you believe him?" Tully asked finally. Keene thought about it. "I don't know, but I believe something's wrong with that tape." They drove back to Cleveland in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. When they got back to the office, there was a message waiting from the forensic audio analyst at Quantico. Keene called him back immediately. The analyst's name was Dr. Marcus Finley, and he'd been examining the confession tape for the past 3 days. His voice on the phone was measured and professional. "The tape has definitely been altered," Finley said without preamble. "There are clear signs of splicing and overdubbing. Someone recorded new audio and layered it over the original confession." Keene felt his stomach drop. How much of it was altered? "Hard to say for certain without the original to compare against," Finley said. "But I'd estimate at least 30%. The sections describing specific crime scene details show the most obvious signs of manipulation. The voice is the same, or very close to it, but the words were recorded at a different time, probably in a different room." "Is it possible to separate the original from the added material?" Tully asked. She'd leaned in close to listen. "I can try," Finley said, "but the quality is poor, and the edits were done a long time ago. The best I can probably do is identify which sections were added, but I can't guarantee I can recover what was originally said." Keene thanked him and hung up. He sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. A fabricated confession. Evidence tampering. This case was turning into something much bigger than a simple cold case review. "We need to find out who had access to that tape," Tully said. "Who could have edited it and why?" Keene nodded. "Let's start with the Youngstown PD. Find out who worked on the original case." It took them 2 days to track down the lead detective from the A1 investigation. His name was Raymond Hargrove, the same detective Barch had mentioned. Hargrove had retired from the force in 2005 and now lived in a suburb south of Cleveland. When Keene called him, Hargrove agreed to meet them at a diner near his home. The diner was one of those old-fashioned places with red vinyl booths and a long counter. Hargrove was already there when they arrived, sitting in a booth near the back. He was in his 70s now, a heavy-set man with white hair and a weathered face. He stood when he saw them, shaking their hands with a firm grip. "Agents," Hargrove said as they sat down, "I heard you were asking about the Barch case. That was a long time ago. We're reviewing the confession," Keene said. "Some questions have come up about the evidence." Hargrove's expression darkened. "Questions? What kind of questions?" "The confession tape," Tully said. "It appears to have been tampered with, edited." Hargrove stared at her. "That's impossible. The tape was locked in evidence the whole time. Nobody touched it except during the trial and appeals." "Someone touched it," Keene said. "A forensic analyst confirmed it. Parts of the confession were recorded at different times and spliced together." For a long moment, Hargrove didn't say anything. He just sat there, his hands flat on the table, his face unreadable. Then he shook his head slowly. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "When I interrogated Barch, I followed procedure. Everything was by the book. If something happened to that tape after it left my hands, that's not on me." Who else had access to it? Tully asked. The evidence techs, the prosecutor's office, the court clerks during the trial, Hargrove said. Could have been anyone. Keene leaned forward. Detective Hargrove, Leonard Barch claims you fed him details during the interrogation, that you told him what to say, and then recorded it. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. Barch is a liar. He killed 3 women, and when he got caught, he tried to weasel out of it by claiming coercion. The jury didn't buy it, and neither should you. The jury never heard the tape, Keene said. It was suppressed because of questions about the interrogation methods, and now we know the tape was altered, so maybe Barch was telling the truth. Hargrove stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I spent 30 years on the force. I put bad people away. I don't need some cold case agent questioning my integrity based on a tape that got corrupted over 3 decades. He threw a few bills on the table and walked out without another word. Keene and Tully sat there, watching him go. He's hiding something, Tully said. Yeah, Keene said. But what? They spent the next week digging deeper. They interviewed other officers who'd worked on the Barch case, but most of them were retired or dead. The few they found didn't remember much about the confession tape. It had been just another piece of evidence in just another case. They pulled the records from the evidence room, trying to trace the chain of custody. The tape had been checked out multiple times over the years, for the trial, for the appeals hearing, for reviews by various attorneys and investigators. Each time, it had been logged out and logged back in, but the logs didn't say anything about the condition of the tape or whether anyone had listened to it. One name kept appearing in the logs. Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard Kelso, the prosecutor who'd handled the appeals. Keene tried calling him again in Florida, but Kelso didn't answer. After several attempts, Keene left a detailed message explaining about the altered tape and asking Kelso to call back. He never did. Meanwhile, Finley at Quantico continued analyzing the tape. He sent them a preliminary report identifying 17 separate instances where the audio had been spliced or overdubbed. In each case, the altered sections contained specific details about the crime scenes, locations, times, descriptions of the victims, methods of killing. It's like someone was building a case, Finley wrote in his report, adding details that would make the confession more convincing, more specific. The original confession was probably more general, more vague. Someone enhanced it. Keene read the report 3 times, trying to understand the implications. If the confession had been deliberately altered, then whoever did it had committed evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, maybe more. But why? To ensure Barch's conviction, or to cover up something else? Late one night, Keene was alone in the office, going through the case file again, when his phone rang. It was August Rook, the records clerk. "Agent Keene," Rook said, his voice tense. "I found something. Can you come down to the archive room?" Keene grabbed his jacket and took the elevator down to the basement. Rook was waiting for him in the archive room, standing beside an open filing cabinet. He looked nervous. "What is it?" Keene asked. Rook held up a manila envelope. "I was doing a complete inventory of the Barch evidence, going through everything we have, and I found this. It was misfiled, stuck in with a different case from the same year." Keene took the envelope. It was labeled with the Barch case number and dated November 1991. Inside was a microcassette tape. "Another tape?" Keene said. "I think it's the original," Rook said. "The real confession, before it was altered." Keene stared at the tape in his hand. "How can you be sure?" "I can't," Rook said. "But look at the labeling. It's different from the other tape. Older ink, different handwriting. And it was filed separately, like someone wanted to keep it away from the rest of the evidence. Keen felt his heart beating faster. We need to listen to this. They went to the tech lab, and Rook loaded the tape into a player. The sound quality was worse than the first tape, more degraded, but the voice was unmistakably Leonard Barch's. Keen and Rook listened in silence as the confession played, but this version was different. Barch's voice was hesitant, uncertain. He stumbled over his words, contradicted himself, asked questions. The detectives' voices were audible in the background, prompting him, correcting him, feeding him information. "No, that's not right," one of the voices said. "She was found in the factory on Sheffield Avenue, not Polk. Try again." Barch's voice. "Okay. She was found in the factory on Sheffield. And how was she positioned? I don't remember exactly. Her hands were crossed over her chest. You did that, remember?" A long pause, then Barch's voice quieter. "Yeah, her hands were crossed." Keen felt sick. This was a coached confession, step by step. The detectives were telling Barch what to say, and he was repeating it back to them. There was nothing voluntary about it. The tape ran for 45 minutes. By the end, Keen understood what had happened. The original interrogation had produced a confession, but it was weak, full of uncertainties and contradictions. Someone had taken that original tape and created a new version, editing out the detective's prompts, adding clearer statements, making it sound like Barch had confessed freely and with full knowledge of the crimes. When the tape ended, Keen and Rook sat in silence. The implications were staggering. "This changes everything," Rook said quietly. Keen nodded. Leonard Barch didn't confess. He was coerced, and then the confession was fabricated to make it look legitimate. "What are you going to do?" Keen thought about it. "I'm going to find out who altered that tape, and I'm going to prove that Barch was innocent." But even as he said it, Keen felt a creeping unease. Because there was still one question that hadn't been answered. If Barch didn't kill those women, then who did? Over the next few days, Keen and Tully worked to compare the two tapes. They brought in Finley from Quantico to analyze both versions side by side. His conclusion was unequivocal. The second tape they'd found was the original, and the first tape had been created by editing and enhancing that original to produce a more convincing confession. Whoever did this had technical skill, Finley said. This was professional work, not something you do with consumer equipment. They had access to audio editing tools, probably in a forensics lab or similar facility. That narrowed the suspects considerably. Not many people had that kind of access in 1991. Keen and Tully started building a list. Evidence technicians, prosecutors, defense attorneys, court officials. Anyone who could have had access to the tape and the equipment to alter it. They focused on the Youngstown PD evidence room first. In '91, the department had 2 evidence technicians on staff. One of them had died in 2010, but the other, a woman named Diane Suker, was still alive and living in Cleveland. Keen and Tully went to see her. Diane Sucher was in her late 50s, a retired police officer who now worked as a security consultant. She invited them into her home office, a small room with a desk and walls covered in certifications and commendations. "The Barch case," Suker said when they explained why they were there. "I remember it. That was a nightmare." "Why?" Tully asked. "Because everyone knew the confession was hinky," Sucher said. "Hargrove and his partner, they leaned on Barch hard. Too hard. And when the tape came out, it sounded off, but nobody wanted to say anything. The case was high profile, and the department needed a win." "Did you handle the confession tape?" Keen asked. Sucher nodded. I logged it into evidence, but after that, it left the building for the trial. When it came back, it went straight into storage. I never listened to it." "Did anyone else have access to the evidence room?" Tully asked. Suture hesitated. "There was one guy, senior investigator named Paul Grimes. He used to come in after hours sometimes, said he was reviewing evidence for cases he was working. I always thought it was weird, but he had clearance." Keene felt a spark of recognition. Paul Grimes. Was he involved in the Barch investigation? "Not officially," Sucker said. "But he was Hargrove's mentor, taught him everything he knew. They were close." Keene and Tully exchanged glances. Another name, another connection. They thanked Sutter and left. In the car, Tully pulled up Paul Grimes on her laptop. He retired in 2000, died in 2012. Looks like he had a long career with Youngstown PD. Multiple commendations, lots of closed cases. "Any complaints?" Keene asked. Tully scrolled through the records. A few, mostly about aggressive interrogation tactics, nothing that stuck. Keene drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. If Grimes had access to the evidence room and he knew audio editing, he could have altered the tape. But why? "To protect Hargrove," Tully said. "If the original confession was obviously coerced, it would have destroyed the case and probably ended Hargrove's career. But if they cleaned it up, made it look legitimate, they could get the conviction." It made sense, but proving it would be difficult. Grimes was dead, and any evidence of what he'd done would have been destroyed long ago. Unless they could find something in the old files, some record or note that connected him to the tape. They spent the next 2 days at the Youngstown PD, going through old evidence logs and case files. It was tedious work, reading through decades-old paperwork, looking for any mention of Paul Grimes or the Barch confession tape. On the 3rd day, they found it. A single entry in an evidence log from December 1 month after Barch's confession. The tape had been checked out for audio enhancement and signed out by Paul Grimes. Keene stared at the entry, his pulse quickening. This was it. Proof that Grimes had taken the tape, that he'd had the opportunity to alter it. But the log also showed that the tape had been returned the next day. And there was a note in Grimes' handwriting. "Audio restored and clarified, ready for trial." "That's a confession," Tully said, reading over Keene's shoulder. "He's admitting he altered it." "But calling it restoration," Keene said. "Like he was just cleaning up the audio, not changing the content." They made copies of the log and returned to Cleveland. That night, Keene couldn't sleep again. He kept thinking about Paul Grimes, about Hargrove, about Leonard Barch sitting in that interrogation room, exhausted and afraid, saying whatever they wanted him to say. And he thought about the 3 women who'd been killed: Angela Drummond, Marie Vickers, Teresa Wick. If Barch hadn't murdered them, then their killer was still out there. Had been out there for over 30 years. The next morning, Keene got a call from Finley at Quantico. "I finished analyzing both tapes," Finley said. "And I found something else. On the original tape, there's a section where Barch is describing the first victim. He says she was found in a building on Polk Street. But the victim was actually found on Sheffield Avenue." "We heard that on the tape," Keene said. "Right, but here's the thing. There was a murder on Polk Street. Different victim, different case. Unsolved homicide from 1989. Woman named Rita Caldwell. She was found in an abandoned building, strangled, posed the same way as the 3 victims attributed to Barch." Keene felt the room tilt. "You're saying there was a 4th victim?" "Or a first victim," Finley said. "The Caldwell murder was never connected to the other 3. Different jurisdiction, different detectives, but the MO matches perfectly." Keene pulled up the Caldwell case file on his computer while Finley talked. Rita Caldwell, age 26, waitress, found dead in an empty warehouse on Polk Street in August 1989. Strangled, hands crossed over her chest, no signs of sexual assault. The case had gone cold within weeks. If Barch was confessing, Keene said slowly, maybe he got confused, mixed up the victims and locations, said Polk Street instead of Sheffield because he was thinking of Caldwell. Or because the detectives fed him the wrong information, Finley said. Either way, this suggests the real killer murdered at least 4 women, not 3. And Barch only confessed to 3. After the call, Keene sat at his desk, staring at the file photo of Rita Caldwell. She looked young, smiling in the picture. Another life cut short. Another unsolved murder. He called Tully over and explained what Finley had found. She listened, her expression growing darker. So, if Barch is innocent, Tully said, then we're looking for a serial killer who's been free for over 30 years, who killed at least 4 women, maybe more, and who let Leonard Barch take the fall, Keene said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Tully asked the question Keene had been afraid to voice. Do you think Hargrove knew? Keene thought about the detective's face in the diner, the way he'd reacted when they mentioned the altered tape. I think he knew the confession was coerced. I think he and Grimes decided to clean it up, make it stick. But whether he knew Barch was innocent, I don't know. We need to talk to him again, Tully said. But when they tried calling Hargrove, his phone went straight to voicemail. They drove to his house, but nobody answered the door. His neighbor said she hadn't seen him in 2 days, which was unusual. Hargrove rarely left his house. Keene felt a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. Something was wrong. They were about to leave when Keene's phone rang. It was the Youngstown PD. A detective named Morales, someone Keene had talked to during the investigation. Agent Keene, Morales said, his voice tight. We've got a situation. Raymond Hargrove is here at the station. He walked in an hour ago and confessed to evidence tampering in the Barch case. Keene's mind reeled. What did he say? He said he and Paul Grimes altered the confession tape in 1991, Morales said. Said they knew the original confession was coerced, so they cleaned it up, made it sound better. He's asking to speak with you. Keene and Tully were back in Youngstown within the hour. Hargrove was sitting in an interview room, looking 20 years older than he had at the diner. His hands shook as he drank water from a paper cup. When Keene and Tully entered, Hargrove looked up at them with hollow eyes. I couldn't let it go, Hargrove said. Not after you told me the tape was altered. I kept thinking about it, about what we did. Grimes said it was the right thing. Said we were just clarifying the confession, making sure the truth came out. But it wasn't the truth, was it? No, Keene said quietly. It wasn't. Hargrove put his face in his hands. We were so sure Barch did it. He fit the profile, he had opportunity. And when he confessed, even if we had to push him, I believed he was guilty. So when Grimes suggested cleaning up the tape, I went along with it. I thought we were doing the right thing. Did you kill those women? Tully asked. Hargrove's head snapped up. What? No. God, no. I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a murderer. Then who did? Keene asked. Hargrove shook his head helplessly. I don't know. After the case fell apart, after Barch was released, I tried to keep investigating. But there were no other suspects, no new leads. The case just died. What about Rita Caldwell? Keene asked. The victim from 1989 on Polk Street. Hargrove frowned. I don't know that name. She was murdered before the others, Keene said. Same M.O., same everything. But it was a different jurisdiction, so nobody connected it. Understanding, dawned in Hargrove's eyes, followed by horror. Jesus. There were 4 victims? At least, Tully said. Hargrove stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. I put an innocent man through hell. I destroyed his life, and the real killer got away. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. The news of Hargrove's confession spread quickly through law enforcement circles. Within days, the district attorney's office announced they were dropping all charges related to the Barch case and opening an investigation into evidence tampering and prosecutorial misconduct. Leonard Barch, who had lived under a cloud of suspicion for over 30 years, was finally officially cleared. But for Keene and Tully, the work was just beginning. They now had 4 unsolved murders spanning from 1989 to 91, and no viable suspects. The real killer had been walking free all this time, and the trail was ice cold. They set up a workspace in the cold case unit, covering one wall with photos of the 4 victims: Rita Caldwell, Angela Drummond, Marie Vickers, and Teresa Wick. 4 young women, all between 23 and 28 years old. All strangled, all posed the same way, all found in abandoned buildings in the Youngstown area. We need to start from scratch, Keene said, standing in front of the wall. Forget everything from the original investigation. Assume Barch had nothing to do with it. Tully was at her desk, going through the original case files on her laptop. The victims had no obvious connection to each other. Different jobs, different neighborhoods, different social circles. The only commonality is geography. They all lived and worked within a 5-mile radius. And they were all taken in the evening or at night, Keene added. Grabbed from parking lots or walking alone. Quick, opportunistic abductions. Which suggests someone familiar with the area, Tully said. Someone who knew the neighborhoods, knew where people would be vulnerable. Keene nodded. They'd been through this type of analysis before. Serial killers often operated in areas they knew well, places where they felt comfortable and could move without drawing attention. The Youngstown murders fit that pattern. Let's look at everyone who was involved in the original investigation, Keene said. Officers, forensic techs, witnesses, anyone who would have had detailed knowledge of the crime scenes. It was a grim thought, the idea that the killer might have been hiding in plain sight, possibly even involved in the investigation. But Keene had worked enough cases to know that it happened more often than people wanted to believe. They spent the next week re-interviewing everyone they could find from the original case. Most of the detectives were retired or dead, but a few were still around. None of them had anything new to offer. The investigation had focused so completely on Barch that other angles had been ignored. One afternoon, Keene received a call from Dr. Finley at Quantico. "I've been doing more analysis on those tapes," Finley said, "and I found something interesting in the background noise." "What kind of something?" Keene asked. "On the altered tape, the one that was edited, there's ambient sound in the background during the overdubbed sections. Very faint, almost imperceptible, but I isolated it and enhanced it. And it's mechanical noise, rhythmic, regular. It sounds like industrial machinery, a pump or compressor maybe. Whatever it is, it was running in the background when they recorded the fake confession segments." Keene felt a tingle of excitement. "Can you identify what kind of machinery?" "Not specifically, but the frequency and pattern suggest something large, industrial grade, the kind of equipment you'd find in a factory or power plant." After the call, Keene pulled up maps of Youngstown from 1991. The city had been full of industrial facilities back then: steel plants, manufacturing facilities, warehouses. Hundreds of buildings with the kind of machinery Finley had described. But one location caught his attention. The old Youngstown Police Department evidence storage facility had been housed in a converted warehouse on the south side. According to the records, The building had previously been used as a machine shop, and some of the old equipment had been left in place, including air compressors and ventilation systems. What if they recorded the fake confession segments at the evidence facility? Keene said to Tully. Grimes had access. He could have brought Barch there or just recorded someone reading the script. Tully looked up from her laptop. Someone? You think Grimes might have used a voice actor or something? I'm saying we don't know for sure that the voice on the altered tape is even Barch, Keene said. Finley said it was very close, but not exact. What if Grimes got someone who sounded like Barch to record the enhanced segments? It was a disturbing possibility. If the altered confession wasn't even Barch's voice, then the entire thing was a fabrication from start to finish. They drove back to Youngstown that afternoon. The old police evidence facility was still standing, though it had been abandoned for almost 20 years. The building was a low, sprawling structure of brick and corrugated metal, surrounded by a chain-link fence covered in rust. Keene and Tully climbed through a gap in the fence and approached the building. The main entrance was padlocked, but one of the side doors had been pried open, probably by vagrants or metal scavengers. They pushed through and stepped inside. The interior was dim and smelled like mold and motor oil. Shafts of dusty light came through holes in the roof, illuminating a vast open space filled with old machinery and equipment. Along one wall were rows of metal shelving units, empty now, where evidence had once been stored. Their flashlights swept across the space. In the far corner, they could see what looked like an old recording setup. A table with a cassette recorder still sitting on it, connected to a microphone by a frayed cable. Beside it was a chair and an industrial work lamp. Keene walked over to the table, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. The recorder was old, covered in dust, but it looked like it had been used relatively recently. He picked it up carefully and examined it. This could be where they made the recordings, Keene said. Tully was looking around the room, her flashlight beam moving across the walls. There's something else here, she said. Keene walked over to where she was standing. She was pointing at a door on the far wall, partially hidden behind a shelving unit. The door was metal, painted gray, with a small window at eye level. They moved the shelving unit aside and tried the door. It was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. Keene put his shoulder into it, and the door groaned open. Behind it was a small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. The walls were cinder block, painted white but stained with age and moisture. In the center of the room was a metal chair bolted to the floor. On the walls were old maps of Youngstown, covered with marks and notations in faded ink. Keene felt his skin crawl. This wasn't just a storage room. It looked like an interrogation space or something worse. Tully was examining the maps. These are marked with locations, she said. Streets, buildings, dates. Keene moved closer. The marks were color-coded, red, blue, green. Some of the locations he recognized immediately. Sheffield Avenue, where Angela Drummond's body had been found. Market Street near the diner where she worked. The parking lot where Marie Vickers disappeared. This is a kill map, Keene said quietly. They stood there in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Someone had used this room to plan the murders, to track the victims, to document everything. And that someone had access to a police evidence facility. Tully pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of the maps, documenting each marking, each notation. Keene walked around the small room, looking for anything else. In one corner, partially hidden behind the door, he found a cardboard box. Inside the box were files. Old case files, photocopies of police reports, crime scene photos, all related to the 4 murders. But there was also something else. A notebook filled with handwritten notes. Keene opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting was neat, methodical. It appeared to be a journal of some kind with entries dated from 1989 to 1992. He started reading, and what he found made his blood run cold. The entries described surveillance of the victims, detailed observations of their routines, where they went, who they talked to. The writer had been watching them for weeks, sometimes months, before they were killed, learning their patterns, planning the abductions. But the most disturbing part was the tone. The entries were clinical, detached, like someone taking notes on an experiment. There was no emotion, no remorse, just cold, calculated observation. "Tully," Keene said, his voice tight. "You need to see this." She came over, and he showed her the notebook. As she read, her expression grew darker. "This is a serial killer's journal," she said. Keene nodded, and whoever wrote it had access to this facility, had access to police files, crime scene information, everything. They bagged the notebook and the files as evidence, then spent another hour searching the room. They found a few other items: old coffee cups, cigarette butts, a jacket hanging on a hook behind the door. Everything was covered in dust, untouched for years. As they were leaving, Tully stopped in the doorway and looked back at the small room. "Someone used this place as their base," she said. "Planned 4 murders from here, maybe more, and then just walked away. Or got scared off when Barch was arrested," Keene said. "Maybe they figured they'd gotten lucky, that someone else was taking the blame. So they stopped. Or they just moved somewhere else," Tully said quietly. It was a thought that neither of them wanted to dwell on. Back at the Cleveland office, they turned the evidence over to the forensic lab. The notebook would be analyzed for fingerprints, DNA, anything that could identify the writer. The cigarette butts and coffee cups would be tested as well. It was a long shot after so many years, but it was all they had. While they waited for the lab results, Keene and Tully continued to dig into the backgrounds of everyone involved in the original investigation. They were looking for someone with access to the evidence facility, someone who would have known about the maps and the room. 3 days later, they got a hit. The DNA from one of the cigarette butts matched a profile in the FBI database. The match was to a man named Vincent Mayhew, a former evidence technician with the Youngstown PD. Keene pulled up Mayhew's file. He had worked for the department from 1987 to 93, handling evidence storage and chain of custody. He'd had full access to the evidence facility, including keys to all the rooms. In 93, he'd been quietly let go after an internal investigation found inconsistencies in evidence logs, but no charges had been filed. After leaving the police department, Mayhew had moved around, working security jobs and private investigation gigs. Currently, according to the records, he was living in Pittsburgh, working as a night watchman at a commercial property. "This is our guy," Tully said, staring at Mayhew's photo on the screen. He was in his 60s now, a thin man with gray hair and cold eyes. "Maybe," Keene said cautiously, "but we need to be sure." They brought the case to the U.S. Attorney's Office and got authorization for surveillance. A team from the Pittsburgh field office was assigned to watch Mayhew while Keene and Tully continued to build the case. The forensic analysis of the notebook was inconclusive. The paper was too old, handled by too many people over the years. They couldn't get clean prints or DNA, but handwriting analysis suggested it had been written by someone with police training, someone familiar with law enforcement documentation style. Keene requested Mayhew's personnel file from the Youngstown PD. When it arrived, he spread it out on his desk and started reading. Mayhew had been a model employee for his first few years, reliable and detail-oriented. But starting in 1990, there were notes about behavioral changes. He'd become withdrawn, started missing shifts, been caught sleeping on the job. There was also a note from a supervisor about Mayhew spending excessive time in the old evidence warehouse, even when he wasn't on duty. When questioned about it, Mayhew had said he was organizing old case files. Nobody had thought much of it at the time. But now, knowing what they knew about the room in that warehouse, the timeline made Keen's skin crawl. Mayhew had been spending time there right when the murders were happening, right when someone was using that room to plan and document the killings. "We need to talk to him," Keen said to Tully. "Bring him in, see if he'll talk." They coordinated with the Pittsburgh office, and 2 days later they picked up Vincent Mayhew at his apartment. He didn't resist, didn't ask for a lawyer. He just sat in the back of the car, silent, as they drove him to the federal building. In the interview room, Mayhew sat with his hands folded on the table, his expression blank. Keen and Tully sat across from him, a folder of evidence between them. "Mr. Mayhew," Keen began, "we'd like to talk to you about your time with the Youngstown Police Department." Mayhew nodded slowly. "That was a long time ago. We're investigating the murders of 4 women between 1989 and 91, Tully said. Angela Drummond, Marie Vickers, Teresa Wick, and Rita Caldwell. "I remember those cases," Mayhew said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "They arrested someone for those. Leonard Barch. Barch was innocent," Keen said. "The confession was fabricated. He didn't kill those women." Mayhew's expression didn't change. "Then who did?" "We were hoping you could tell us," Tully said. For a long moment, Mayhew just stared at them. Then he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Keen opened the folder and pulled out photos of the room in the evidence warehouse. The maps, the chair, the markings on the walls. He spread them out on the table. "We found this room in the old evidence facility," Keen said. "We found a journal documenting surveillance of all 4 victims. We found your DNA at the scene." Mayhew looked at the photos, but said nothing. "We know you had access to that facility," Tully said. "We know you spent time there, often when you weren't on duty. We know the murders stopped right after you left the police department." "That doesn't prove anything," Mayhew said. "Then help us understand," Keen said, leaning forward. "If you didn't kill those women, why was your DNA in that room? Why were you spending so much time there?" Mayhew's jaw tightened. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, something else, something cold. "I want a lawyer," he said. The interview ended there. Mayhew was placed in federal custody pending formal charges. The U.S. Attorney's Office was confident they had enough for an indictment, but Keen knew it would be a difficult case. The evidence was old, circumstantial. A good defense attorney could create reasonable doubt, but at least they had someone in custody. At least the investigation was moving forward. 2 weeks later, something happened that changed everything. Keen was at his desk reviewing the case file for what felt like the 100th time when his phone rang. It was a detective from the Pittsburgh PD. "Agent Keen," the detective said, "we've got a situation. A body was found this morning in an abandoned building on the south side. Young woman, strangled, posed with her hands crossed over her chest." Keen felt his stomach drop. "When?" "Coroner estimates time of death at around midnight last night." Keen checked the date. Vincent Mayhew had been in federal custody for the past 2 weeks. There was no way he could have committed this murder. "I'll be there in 3 hours," Keen said. The drive to Pittsburgh was the longest of Keen's life. Beside him, Tully sat in silence, both of them trying to process what this meant. If someone had been killed with the same Mo while Mayhew was in custody, then either Mayhew wasn't the killer, or there was a partner they didn't know about. The crime scene was in an industrial area on Pittsburgh's south side, not far from where Mayhew lived. The building was an old warehouse, empty for years. Inside, police had set up lights and cordoned off the area where the body had been found. The victim was a woman in her mid-20s, dressed in jeans and a jacket. She'd been strangled, and her hands were crossed over her chest. The similarities to the Youngstown murders were unmistakable. Keene and Tully spent hours at the scene, documenting everything, talking to the forensic team. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The killer had taken her somewhere else, killed her, and brought her here to pose her. "This doesn't make sense," Tully said as they left the building. "Mayhew's been locked up. He couldn't have done this. Unless he's not working alone," Keene said. But that theory fell apart when the forensic team found DNA at the scene. It wasn't Mayhew's eyes, it was someone else's. Someone who wasn't in any database. Over the next few days, the investigation fractured into two parallel tracks. Mayhew remained in custody, charged with the 4 Youngstown murders. But the new murder in Pittsburgh was being treated as a separate case, possibly a copycat. Keene didn't believe in coincidences. The MO was too specific, too exact. This wasn't someone copying details from old news reports. This was someone who knew exactly how the original murders had been committed, someone who had access to information that had never been made public. He went back to the evidence warehouse in Youngstown, back to that small room with the maps. He stood there alone, trying to understand, trying to piece together what he was missing. On one of the maps, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A marking in the corner, faded with age. It wasn't a location or a date. It was a name, written in small letters. PG. Keene pulled out his phone and called Tully. "The map's in the evidence room. There's a notation. The initials PG. Paul Grimes," Tully said immediately. Keene felt a chill run through him. Grimes had access to the evidence facility. He was the one who altered Barch's confession tape. What if he was involved in more than just tampering with evidence? "You think Grimes was the killer?" "I think it's possible," Keene said. "And if he had a partner, someone who's still out there..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Paul Grimes had died in 2012, but Keene requested a full background investigation anyway. What they found was disturbing. Grimes had been a decorated detective, but there were gaps in his personnel file, periods where his activities weren't well documented. And during those gaps, there had been unsolved disappearances and murders in the Youngstown area. One case in particular stood out. A woman named Carol Brenner, who vanished in 1987. Her body was never found, but witnesses reported seeing her get into a car with a man matching Grimes' description. The case had been investigated briefly, then dropped. Keene tracked down Grimes' former partner, a retired detective named Harold Jessup. Jessup was in his 80s now, living in a nursing home in Akron. When Keene visited him, Jessup's memory was spotty, but he remembered Paul Grimes. "Paul was a good cop," Jessup said. "But he changed in the late 80s, became secretive, started working odd hours. I asked him about it once, and he got angry. Told me to mind my own business." "Did you ever suspect him of anything?" Keene asked. Jessup was quiet for a long moment. "There were rumors, women going missing, cases that didn't get solved. Some of the younger officers thought Paul might know more than he was saying, but nobody wanted to accuse a senior detective. Not without proof." "Did Grimes have any close friends on the force?" Keene asked. "Anyone he might have confided in?" Jessup thought about it. He mentored a few people. Raymond Hargrove was one. And there was an evidence tech he was friendly with. Can't remember the name. Young guy, worked nights. "Vincent Mayhew?" Keene asked. Jessup's eyes widened. "That's it, Mayhew. Paul used to spend a lot of time with him. I thought it was odd, a detective being so friendly with an evidence tech. But Paul said Mayhew was helping him with old cases." Keene left the nursing home with a sick feeling in his stomach. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture he didn't want to see. Paul Grimes had been a serial killer, operating for years without being caught. He'd used his position in the police department to access crime scenes, manipulate evidence, stay ahead of any investigation. And he'd recruited Vincent Mayhew, brought him into it, trained him. When Barch was arrested, Grimes saw an opportunity. He could pin his crimes on someone else, close the cases, and continue operating. So, he and Hargrove had manufactured the confession, making sure Barch looked guilty. But the plan had fallen apart when the confession was thrown out. Grimes and Mayhew had stopped killing, lying low, waiting. And when Grimes died in 2012, Mayhew had stayed quiet, living a normal life. Until now. Until the case was reopened, and the pressure started building. Then Mayhew had killed again, maybe out of compulsion, maybe to send a message. But there was still a piece missing. The new murder in Pittsburgh. The DNA that didn't match Mayhew. If Grimes was dead and Mayhew was in custody, who had killed that woman? Keene was still wrestling with that question when he got a call from the Pittsburgh PD. They'd made an arrest in the new murder case. A man named Dale Torrance, picked up after a traffic stop with the victim's purse in his car. Keene and Tully drove to Pittsburgh to interview him. Torrance was in his 30s, a drifter with a long criminal record. He confessed to the murder almost immediately, said he'd grabbed the woman off the street, killed her, and dumped her body in the warehouse. "Why did you pose her that way?" Keene asked, with her hands crossed. Torrance shrugged. "I don't know. It just felt right." "Did someone tell you to do it that way?" Tully asked. "No, I saw it in a dream or something. I don't remember." They pressed him, but he didn't have anything more to say. He was just a killer who'd happened to use the same MO, an awful coincidence. Keene wanted to believe it. But something about the timing, about the way everything had lined up, bothered him. Back in Cleveland, he pulled the surveillance footage from the federal detention center where Mayhew was being held. He watched hours of recordings, looking for anything unusual. And finally, he found it. 3 days before the Pittsburgh murder, Mayhew had received a visitor. The visitor logs listed it as his attorney, but when Keene checked with the public defender's office, they said no one from their staff had visited him that day. Keene requested the visitor sign-in sheet and got a name, Marcus Grimes. Paul Grimes had a son. Marcus Grimes didn't exist in any official capacity. No driver's license, no social security records, no employment history. The name on the visitor log was fake, written in careful block letters that revealed nothing about the person who'd signed it. The security camera footage from the detention center showed a man in his 40s, average height and build, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He'd kept his head down the entire time, never looking directly at the cameras. Keene sat in the surveillance room, watching the footage over and over. The man had spent 20 minutes with Mayhew, sitting across from him in the visitor's booth, speaking through the glass partition. The audio wasn't recorded, so Keene could only watch their lips move, trying to read something, anything, from their body language. Mayhew had listened mostly, nodding occasionally. The visitor had done most of the talking, leaning forward, his hands gesturing. At one point, he'd written something on a piece of paper and held it up to the glass for Mayhew to see. Then he'd torn it up and put the pieces in his pocket. 3 days later, Dale Torrance had killed a woman in Pittsburgh using the exact same method as the Youngstown murders. "It's not a coincidence," Tully said, standing beside Keene. They'd watched the footage together a dozen times. This man visited Mayhew, and days later someone murders a woman using their signature. But Torrance confessed, Keene said. He gave us details. He knew things. What if someone told him those details? Tully said. What if this Marcus Grimes, or whoever he is, found Torrance, manipulated him, convinced him to kill that woman? Keene thought about it. Torrance was a drifter with mental health issues, a history of violence. Someone with the right psychological manipulation skills could potentially convince him to do almost anything. And serial killers sometimes recruited others, created disciples, built their own legacy through protégés. We need to find Paul Grimes's son, Keene said. They started digging into Paul Grimes' personal life. He'd been married twice, divorced both times. No children listed on any official documents, but that didn't mean there weren't any. Plenty of fathers had children they never acknowledged, especially in cases involving affairs or estrangement. Keene contacted both of Grimes' ex-wives. The first one, married to him from 1978 to 1985, said they'd never had children. She described Grimes as a cold, distant man who spent most of his time at work. The marriage had ended after she caught him having an affair with a woman from the police department. The second wife, married from 1987 to 1994, had more to say. Her name was Patricia Yunt, and she lived in Columbus now. When Keene called her, she was hesitant at first, but when he mentioned it was about Paul Grimes and the murders, she agreed to meet. Keene and Tully drove to Columbus the next day. Patricia lived in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood. She was in her 60s, with gray-streaked hair and tired eyes. She invited them in and made coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. I haven't thought about Paul in years, she said, sitting down across from them. When we divorced, I changed my name back and moved away. Tried to forget that part of my life. Why? Tully asked gently. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Because I was afraid of him. By the end, I was terrified. She told them the marriage had started well enough, but Paul had changed over time. He became controlling, paranoid, violent. He'd come home at odd hours, his clothes dirty, sometimes with what looked like blood on them. When she asked questions, he'd fly into rages. I started to think he was having an affair, Patricia said. But it was worse than that. I found things in his garage one night. Photographs, women I didn't know, maps with locations marked, a journal filled with detailed descriptions of terrible things. Keene leaned forward. What did you do? I confronted him, Patricia said. And he told me if I ever said anything to anyone, he'd kill me. I believed him, so I stayed quiet, waited until I could divorce him and get away. Did Paul have any children? Keene asked. Patricia's expression changed, became guarded. Why do you ask? We think he might have a son, someone who's continuing his work. Patricia put her face in her hands. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes. There was a boy, she said quietly. Marcus. Paul's son from before we met. He was from a relationship Paul had with a woman in Cleveland. The mother died when Marcus was young, and Paul had custody for a while, but then the boy went to live with relatives. Paul rarely talked about him. Do you know where Marcus is now? Tully asked. No. Paul cut off contact with him when Marcus was a teenager. Said the boy was troubled, that he reminded him too much of his mistakes. I only met Marcus once when he was maybe 15. He came to visit, and it was unsettling. How so? Keene asked. He was quiet, polite, but there was something in his eyes, the way he looked at people. Cold, calculating, like his father. Patricia paused. Paul told me once that Marcus was the only person who really understood him. I thought it was just talk, but now, hearing what you're telling me, she gave them what little information she had. Marcus would be in his early 40s now. The relatives he'd gone to live with were on his mother's side, a family named Strickland in the Cleveland area. Keene and Tully spent the drive back to Cleveland in tense silence. They were getting closer, but the trail was still faint, still uncertain. The Strickland family took some time to locate. The surname was common, and the records were scattered. But eventually they found them. A couple named Edward and Louise Strickland, who had taken in a teenage boy in '95. The Stricklands were both dead now, but they'd had a daughter still living in Cleveland. Her name was Jennifer Strickland Boone, and when Keene called her, she remembered Marcus. "He lived with us for 3 years," Jennifer said over the phone. "From when he was 15 until he turned 18. Then he left, and we never heard from him again." "What was he like?" Keene asked. "Quiet, reserved. He kept to himself mostly. My parents tried to help him, get him counseling, but he never opened up. He'd spend hours in his room, reading or writing. Sometimes we'd hear him talking to himself, having conversations with someone who wasn't there." "Do you know where he went after he left?" "No idea. He packed his things one morning and just walked out. My parents tried to find him, but it was like he vanished." "Did he ever mention his father?" Tully asked. There was a long pause. "Once. I asked him about his dad, and he said his father was a great man, that he taught him important things about the world, about people. It was the only time I ever heard him sound emotional." After the call, Keene ran Marcus Grimes through every database he could access. No criminal record, no employment history, no tax returns. The man was a ghost. Either he was living off the grid, or he was using a different identity. "He's been planning this for a long time," Tully said. "Living under the radar, waiting for the right moment." "But why now?" Keene asked. "Why visit Mayhew? Why orchestrate a copycat murder?" "To send a message," Tully said. "To let us know he's out there, that his father's work isn't finished." It was a chilling thought. Serial killers sometimes sought recognition, wanted their crimes to be remembered. If Marcus Grimes was anything like his father, he wasn't done. The next break came from an unexpected source. August Rook, the records clerk, called Keene late one evening. "Agent Keene," Rook said, his voice uncertain. "I found something else, another tape." Keene felt a chill run through him. "Another confession tape?" "No, something different. It was in the same misfiled box where I found the original Barch tape. This one's labeled as an interview with Paul Grimes, recorded 2 weeks before he died." "Interview with who?" "Doesn't say, but I listened to part of it. You need to hear this." Keene and Tully met Rook at the field office within the hour. They went down to the archive room and Rook played the tape. The recording was poor quality, scratchy and faint, but Paul Grimes' voice was unmistakable, older and weaker than on the Barch tape, but still recognizable. "I don't have much time left," Grimes said on the recording. "The cancer's spreading, but I wanted to leave this, a record, so someone would understand." There was a pause, the sound of labored breathing. "I did things, terrible things, but they were necessary. The world is full of chaos, disorder. I brought structure to it, purpose. Every death had meaning." Another pause. "Leonard Barch was weak, convenient. We needed someone to take the blame, and he was there. Raymond didn't understand the bigger picture. He thought we were just protecting ourselves. But it was more than that. We were creating something." Keene felt sick listening to it. "Vincent understood," Grimes continued. "He saw what I saw. that some people exist only to be removed, that we were doing important work. The recording continued for several more minutes, Grimes rambling about his philosophy, his justifications. And then, near the end, he said something that made Keen's blood run cold. "My son will continue this. Marcus has the gift. He's been watching, learning. When I'm gone, he'll carry on. The work doesn't end with me." The tape ended with a click. Keen, Tully, and Rook sat in silence. Outside the archive room, the building was quiet, empty. "He was grooming his son," Tully said finally, "teaching him, preparing him to take over." "But if Marcus has been doing this for years," Keen said, "there should be other victims, other unsolved murders with the same M.O. They spent the next 3 days searching. They looked at unsolved homicides across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and surrounding states, searching for cases with similar patterns. Young women strangled, posed with hands crossed over their chests, found in abandoned buildings. They found 6 more cases. 6 women murdered between 2013 and the present, all in different cities, all with the same signature. The cases had never been connected because they were spread out geographically and temporally, but when you laid them out together, the pattern was unmistakable. Marcus Grimes had been killing for almost a decade, moving from city to city, leaving bodies in his wake. And now, with his father's partner in custody and the old cases reopened, he'd decided to make himself known. Keen assembled a task force. They issued a bolo for Marcus Grimes, though they didn't have a current photo. They put surveillance on Vincent Mayhew in case Marcus tried to contact him again. They reached out to local police departments in cities where the unsolved murders had occurred. But weeks passed, and there was no sign of Marcus Grimes. It was like he'd disappeared into thin air. Then, on a cold morning in March, Keen received a letter at his office. It was postmarked from Cleveland, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Agent Keen, you've been looking for me. I appreciate your diligence. My father always said the FBI was thorough. He respected that. You want to know why I visited Vincent? I wanted to see if he was still loyal, if he understood the importance of our work. He does. Even after all these years, he remembers what my father taught him. Dale Torrance was an experiment, a test to see if you'd connect the pieces. You did, faster than I expected. The 4 women in Youngstown were my father's. The others, scattered across the years, were mine. Each one carefully chosen, each one serving a purpose. You'll never find all of them. Some bodies will never be discovered. I'm writing this because I want you to understand something. My father was a great man. He saw the world clearly, without the delusions most people have. He taught me to see the same way. And now I'm teaching others. You caught Vincent, but he was old, careless. The new students are better, smarter. They're out there now, learning, practicing. By the time you find one, 3 more will have taken their place. You can't stop this, Agent Keen. My father's work will continue long after I'm gone. The structure he created, the purpose he defined, it's bigger than any one person. Enjoy your search." The letter wasn't signed. Keen read it 3 times, his hands shaking. Tully stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. "He's recruiting," she said quietly, "creating more killers. We need to trace this letter," Keen said. "Find out where it was mailed from, who handled it." But they both knew it would lead nowhere. Marcus Grimes was too careful, too practiced. He'd been evading detection for years. The forensic team analyzed the letter. No fingerprints, no DNA, generic paper and envelope purchased from any office supply store. The postmark was from a postal facility in downtown Cleveland that processed thousands of letters a day. They interviewed employees at the facility, showed them a composite sketch of Marcus Grimes based on the detention center footage. Nobody remembered seeing him. Keene put the letter in an evidence bag and added it to the case file. Then he went back to his desk and stared at the wall of victims' photos. 4 women from Youngstown, 6 more from other cities. 10 lives ended, 10 families destroyed. And somewhere out there, Marcus Grimes was planning number 11. Weeks turned into months. The task force continued their work, following up on leads, investigating similar murders. They arrested 2 men in unrelated cases, both using similar methods but with no connection to Grimes. Copycats, maybe, or just killers with similar signatures. Vincent Mayhew went to trial and was convicted of the 4 Youngstown murders. He never admitted to anything, never spoke about Paul Grimes or Marcus. He was sentenced to life without parole. Leonard Barch filed a lawsuit against the Youngstown PD for wrongful prosecution. The case was settled out of court. Barch used the money to move to Florida, trying to build a new life away from the shadow of the accusations that had haunted him for 3 decades. Raymond Hargrove pled guilty to evidence tampering and served 2 years in federal prison. After his release, he wrote a book about the case trying to justify his actions. It didn't sell well, and Marcus Grimes remained free. Keene couldn't let it go. Even after the task force was disbanded, even after the case was officially moved to inactive status, he continued to work it. He kept files at home, spent his evenings reviewing evidence, looking for patterns. Tully stayed with it too. They'd meet for coffee once a week, compare notes, discuss theories. They became experts on Marcus Grimes, learning everything they could about him, trying to predict where he might surface next. One night, almost a year after they'd received the letter, Keene was alone in his apartment when his phone rang. It was an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Agent Keene." The voice was calm, measured, vaguely familiar. "Who is this?" "You know who this is." Keene's heart raced. He fumbled for his recording device, turning it on. "Marcus Grimes. I thought we should talk. You've been working so hard, trying to find me. It seems rude not to acknowledge your efforts." "Where are you?" Keene asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Nearby. I've been watching you, Agent Keene. You and Agent Tully, you're dedicated. My father would have liked you." "Your father was a murderer." "My father was an artist," Marcus said. "He saw beauty in structure, in the careful orchestration of chaos into order. He taught me to see it too." "You're sick. You need help." Marcus laughed, a dry sound. "That's what everyone says about people like us. But we're not sick. We're evolved. We see past the lies society tells itself about the value of human life." "Then why are you calling?" Keene asked. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that you'll never catch me. I'm too careful, too patient. But I also want you to keep trying. Because the game is what makes it interesting. My father never had a worthy opponent. You and Agent Tully, you might be." "This isn't a game," Keene said, his voice hard. "You're killing people. Everyone dies, Agent Keene. I'm just choosing when and how, giving their deaths meaning they wouldn't otherwise have. If you believe that, then turn yourself in. Face justice. Justice is a construct, and constructs can be dismantled." Marcus paused. "I should go. But before I do, I want to give you something, a gift." "What kind of gift?" "Information. There's going to be another one, soon, in Cleveland. But I'm not going to tell you where or when. You'll have to figure it out." "Wait," Keene started. But the line went dead. He immediately called Tully, then contacted the task force coordinator. Within hours, they had every available agent working to prevent the next murder. They increased patrols in high-risk areas, put out alerts to local hospitals and shelters, warned women to be cautious. But Cleveland was a big city, with hundreds of abandoned buildings, thousands of potential targets. They couldn't protect everyone. 3 days passed, then a week. No new murders, no more contact from Marcus Grimes. Keene barely slept, spending every waking hour trying to think like the killer, trying to anticipate his next move. Then, on a Thursday evening, a body was found in an abandoned factory on the east side. A young woman, strangled, hands crossed over her chest. The same signature, the same careful positioning. Keene arrived at the scene within 30 minutes. The forensic team was already working, documenting everything. The victim's ID showed she was 24 years old, a graduate student at Cleveland State University. She'd been reported missing 2 days earlier. Keene stood over the body, looking down at her peaceful face, her hands arranged just so. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Helplessness. Despite everything they'd done, all the resources they'd used, all the warnings they'd issued, Marcus Grimes had still managed to kill again. And he would kill again. And again. Until they stopped him, or until he decided to stop himself. As the forensic team worked, Keene noticed something odd. Near the victim's body, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small object. He knelt down and picked it up carefully with gloved hands. It was a microcassette tape. Keene felt his stomach drop. He bagged the tape and took it back to the field office. In the tech lab, he loaded it into a player and pressed play. The voice that came through the speakers was Marcus Grimes. "Agent Keene, by the time you hear this, you'll have found my latest work. I wanted to leave you something to remember me by, a recording, like my father used to make. A confession, if you will." There was a pause, the sound of breathing. "I want you to know that this isn't personal. You're a good investigator, dedicated to your work, but you're chasing something you can't catch. I'm always 3 steps ahead, always planning the next move while you're still processing the last one." Another pause. "I'm leaving Cleveland soon. There are other cities, other opportunities, but I'll think of you sometimes. Wonder if you're still searching, still hoping to find me. Maybe one day you will. Maybe one day I'll get careless or unlucky. But until then, this is goodbye." The recording ended with a soft click. Keene sat in the silence of the tech lab, the tape still spinning in the player. Around him, the fluorescent lights hummed, and somewhere in the building a phone was ringing. He thought about the 10 victims they knew about. The others Marcus had mentioned, bodies that might never be found. The students he'd recruited, learning his methods, carrying on his father's work. And he thought about the future, about the other women who would die because they couldn't stop him. Tully found him there an hour later, still sitting in the dark lab. "We'll get him," she said, though they both knew it might not be true. Keene nodded slowly. "Yeah, we'll get him." But as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus Grimes was out there somewhere watching, waiting, planning his next move in a game that had no end. The case remained open. Keene and Tully continued to work it, following leads, investigating similar murders across the country. Sometimes they thought they were getting close. Sometimes they'd find evidence that suggested Marcus had been in a certain place at a certain time. But they never found him. Years passed. Keene retired from the FBI in 2031, but he never stopped looking. He kept the case files, the photos, the recordings. He maintained a database of unsolved murders that might be connected to Marcus Grimes. The count kept growing. By the time Keene was 70, there were over 40 possible victims scattered across 15 states. But no arrests, no solid leads, just a trail of bodies and unanswered questions. Late one night in his retirement, Keene sat in his study looking at the wall where he'd pinned the victims' photos. 4 women from Youngstown where it all started. 6 more in other cities. and dozens more whose cases might never be definitively linked to the Grimes family. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered, though he knew he probably shouldn't. "Hello, Agent Keene." The voice was older now, rougher, but still unmistakable. "Marcus, I heard you retired. Thought I should call and congratulate you on a long career." Keene didn't say anything. What was there to say? "I'm an old man now," Marcus continued. "My health isn't what it used to be. But the work continues. I have students, protégés, people who understand what my father and I understood." "Where are you?" Keene asked, though he knew it was pointless. "Does it matter anymore? We're both old men now, Agent Keene. The game is almost over." "It was never a game. Everything's a game," Marcus said. "You just never learned the rules." He paused. "I'm calling to tell you something. I'm going to stop. Not because you caught me, but because I choose to. My work is done. The structure my father created, it's solid now, self-sustaining. I don't believe you. You don't have to believe me, but it's the truth. I've killed 43 people over the years. 43 lives given purpose and meaning through their deaths. That's my legacy." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice softer. "Thank you, Agent Keene, for making it interesting, for giving me a worthy opponent. My father never had that." "Don't," Keene started, but the line went dead. He never heard from Marcus Grimes again. The murders continued sporadically over the years that followed, but the signature changed slightly, evolved. Different methods, different positioning. Whether it was Marcus's students or just other killers with similar pathologies, Keene couldn't say. He died in 2035, at the age of 74, the case still unsolved. The last thing he did before he passed was update his database one final time. 47 possible victims. 47 women whose deaths might be connected to Paul Grimes and his son. 47 families still waiting for answers. The files were inherited by Mara Tully, still working cold cases for the FBI. She continued the investigation, searching for Marcus Grimes even though she knew in her heart he was probably dead too. But sometimes, late at night, she'd get a call. Unknown number. And when she answered, there would be nothing but silence on the other end. Just breathing. And then a click. And she'd wonder if somewhere out there Marcus Grimes was still alive, still watching, still playing his game. The confession tape that started it all sat in an evidence locker in Cleveland. The altered version and the original, side by side. Two versions of a lie that had led to 30 years of death. Sometimes, new agents in the cold case unit would pull the tapes out, listen to Leonard Barch's voice describing murders he didn't commit. They'd read about the investigation, about the evidence tampering, about the serial killers who'd hidden in plain sight for decades. And they'd wonder how many other cases were like this, how many other confessions were fabricated, how many other killers were out there protected by the very system designed to catch them. The case file remained open, officially unsolved. Marcus Grimes was never found, never brought to justice. His students, if they existed, were never identified. And somewhere in America, women continued to disappear, found later in abandoned buildings with their hands crossed over their chests. The Appalachian Mountains looked different at night. Special Agent Quentin Yarborough had made this drive a dozen times over the past 2 years, always in daylight, always with clear skies and good visibility. But tonight, with fog rolling down from the ridges and his headlights barely cutting through the darkness, the familiar route felt alien and wrong. Beside him in the passenger seat, Sable Whitcomb sat with a laptop balanced on her knees, checking and rechecking the coordinates. She was the WITSEC handler for this particular asset, a woman who'd spent 15 years managing protected witnesses for the U.S. Marshal Service before transferring to the FBI's witness security program. She knew these mountains as well as anyone, knew every safe house and fallback location in the region. "Signals still active," Whitcomb said, her voice tight. Satellite phone pinged the tower at 9:47 p.m. Location matches the safe house coordinates. Yarborough glanced at the dashboard clock. It was just past midnight now. 3 hours since the ping. 3 hours since anyone had heard from their protected witness. 3 hours was a lifetime in witness protection, when someone wasn't supposed to make contact at all, except in emergencies. The witness's name was Thomas Landry, though that wasn't the name he'd been living under for the past 18 months. Landry had been a mid-level accountant for a criminal organization operating out of Philadelphia, and when the feds had finally built their case against the organization's leadership, Landry had agreed to testify. His testimony had put 6 people in federal prison, including 2 men with extensive connections to organized crime networks along the East Coast. The safe house was deep in the West Virginia mountains, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound through dense forest. It had been chosen specifically because of its isolation, because someone would have to work very hard to find it. The house itself was a small cabin, modernized with security systems and satellite communication, but designed to look like any other hunting camp in the area. Yarborough took the turnoff onto the gravel road, feeling the car's suspension protest as they climbed higher into the mountains. The fog was thicker here, reducing visibility to maybe 20 feet. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches scraping against the roof of the car. "This is wrong," Whitcomb said suddenly. Yarborough looked at her. "What?" "The ping. The timing. Landry knows better than to use the satellite phone except in a life-or-death emergency. He's been doing everything right for 18 months, following every protocol. So why would he suddenly break discipline now?" It was a good question, one Yarborough had been asking himself since they'd received the alert. The satellite phone was for emergencies only, and when it activated, it automatically sent a distress signal to the monitoring station. But there had been no voice communication, no message, just the ping showing the phone had been turned on and then immediately off. "Maybe he saw something," Yarborough said. "Something that spooked him. Then why not call it in? Why just activate the phone and hang up?" Yarborough didn't have an answer for that. They reached the safe house 20 minutes later. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees, a modest log cabin with a metal roof and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. There were no lights on inside, and the security gate across the driveway was closed but not locked. Yarborough parked the car and killed the engine. For a moment, they both sat there in the darkness, listening. The forest was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of branches settling. "Standard approach," Yarborough said, drawing his service weapon. "I'll take the front. You circle around to the back door." Whitcomb nodded and got out of the car. She was armed too, though her role as a handler meant she spent more time behind a desk than in the field. But she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd been trained well and never forgotten. Yarborough approached the front door slowly, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement. The porch boards creaked under his weight, sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. He reached the door and tested the handle. Locked. He knocked, 3 sharp raps. "Federal agents, Mr. Landry, if you're inside, please respond." Nothing. No sound from inside the house. No lights turning on, no footsteps. Yarborough knocked again, louder this time. "Thomas Landry, this is Special Agent Yarborough. We received your distress signal. Are you all right?" Still nothing. He heard Whitcomb's voice from around the side of the house. "Back door's locked, too. No signs of forced entry." Yarborough pulled out his keyring and found the master key for the safe house. He unlocked the door and pushed it open slowly, his weapon leading the way. The interior of the cabin was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he could make out the basic layout. A living room with a couch and chairs, a small kitchen to the right, a hallway leading back to what he knew were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. "Landry," he called out. "FBI, we're coming in." He stepped inside, and Whitcomb came in through the back door a moment later. They moved through the house methodically, clearing each room, checking closets and under beds. It didn't take long. The cabin was small, and there weren't many places to hide. Thomas Landry wasn't there, but someone had been. Recently. In the kitchen, there was a coffee mug on the counter, still half full. The liquid cold but not yet developing a film on top. In the living room, the couch cushions were disturbed, pressed down like someone had been sitting there. A book lay open on the side table. A thriller novel with a bookmark about 3/4 of the way through. The bedrooms were tidy, beds made, no obvious signs of disturbance. In the main bedroom, Yarborough found a packed duffel bag in the closet, ready to go. Standard protocol for witnesses in WITSEC. Always have a go bag ready in case you need to evacuate quickly. The satellite phone was on the nightstand beside the bed. Yarborough picked it up carefully, using a pen to avoid disturbing any fingerprints. The phone was off now, but the call log showed it had been activated at 9:47 p.m., just as Whitcomb had said. The call had lasted less than 10 seconds. Not long enough for voice communication, just long enough to trigger the distress beacon. Why would he activate it and then not talk? Whitcomb said, standing in the doorway. Yarborough examined the room more carefully. Everything looked normal at first glance, but as he looked closer, he started noticing small details that didn't quite fit. The books on the shelf were arranged differently than he remembered from his last security check. Not wrong, exactly, just different. A pair of shoes by the closet door were positioned at an odd angle, toes pointing away from the closet instead of toward it. And on the dresser, there was a framed photo of a mountain landscape that Yarborough didn't remember seeing before. "Was that photo here during the last inspection?" Yarborough asked, pointing. Whitcomb looked at it, frowning. "I don't think so. Landry wasn't supposed to have personal items. No family photos. Nothing that could identify him." Yarborough walked over and picked up the frame. It was a generic mountain scene, the kind of thing you might buy at a tourist shop. But when he turned it over, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. On the back of the frame, someone had written a date in pencil. October 14th. Today was October 15th. "He left this yesterday," Yarborough said, showing Whitcomb. "The day before he disappeared. Why would he do that? I don't know, but he wanted someone to find it." They searched the rest of the house more carefully, looking for other things that might have been placed or moved deliberately. In the bathroom, the medicine cabinet had been rearranged, with the bottles lined up in a way that seemed too neat, too orderly. In the kitchen, the refrigerator magnets were positioned to spell out what looked like random letters. TRACK. "He's leaving us messages," Whitcomb said. "But why not just write a note?" "Because he thought someone else might find it first," Yarborough said. "Someone who wasn't us." The implications of that settled over them like a cold weight. If Landry thought the safe house had been compromised, if he believed someone other than the FBI might come looking for him, then they had a serious problem. WITSEC locations were supposed to be absolutely secure, known only to a handful of people with the highest clearances. Yarborough pulled out his phone and called the regional coordinator for witness protection, a senior agent named Malcolm Driscoll. The call went through on the second ring. "Yarborough," Driscoll said. "What's the situation?" "The witness is gone," Yarborough said. "House is empty, but there are signs he left deliberately. He's been leaving coded messages. There was a pause on the other end. Define coded messages. Rearranged items, a photo with a date, refrigerator magnets spelling track. Like he knew someone was watching him and he couldn't communicate openly. Jesus, Driscoll said, quietly. You think the location was compromised? That's what it looks like. All right, I'm activating the emergency protocol. Don't touch anything else in that house. I'm sending a forensic team, and I want a full security audit of everyone who had access to that location's coordinates. This stays quiet until we know what we're dealing with. Understood. Yarborough hung up and looked at Whitcomb. We need to seal this house and wait for forensics. But I want to check the perimeter first, see if there are any tracks or signs of how he left. They went outside and began circling the cabin, using flashlights to examine the ground. The earth was soft from recent rain, and in several places near the tree line they found footprints. Boot prints, size 10 or 11, leading away from the cabin into the forest. But there was something odd about the tracks. They seemed to come and go in patterns that didn't make sense, doubling back on themselves, appearing in places where there was no clear path. And in one spot, about 50 yards from the cabin, the tracks just stopped. Not at a road or clearing, but in the middle of the forest floor, as if whoever had been walking had simply vanished. Yarborough knelt down and examined the last set of prints. They were clear, well-defined, pressed deep into the mud. And then nothing. Just undisturbed forest floor stretching in every direction. That's not possible, Whitcomb said, standing beside him. You can't just disappear in the middle of the woods. No, Yarborough agreed. You can't. But the evidence was right there in front of them. Footprints leading nowhere, a witness who'd vanished without a trace, and a safe house that felt wrong in ways Yarborough couldn't quite articulate. They spent the next hour documenting everything, taking photos, making notes. By the time the forensic team arrived, just after 2 in the morning, Yarborough had walked the perimeter 3 times and found 2 more sets of tracks that ended abruptly, as if the people making them had been lifted straight up into the air. The forensic team was led by a technician named Patricia Vaught, a meticulous woman in her 40s who'd worked more witness protection cases than anyone Yarborough knew. She took one look at the crime scene photos and shook her head. This doesn't make any sense, Vaught said. If Landry left voluntarily, there should be vehicle tracks. If he was taken, there should be signs of a struggle. But this? She gestured at the photos of the footprints. This is like he walked into the forest and dematerialized. Could someone have covered the tracks? Whitcomb asked. Used a branch to sweep them away? Maybe, Vaught said. But that would take time and leave its own traces. The forest floor here is mostly leaves and pine needles over soft earth. You can't erase tracks completely, not without leaving evidence of the erasure. She set her team to work processing the house, dusting for prints, collecting trace evidence, documenting every detail. Yarborough and Whitcomb stood on the porch, watching the morning fog begin to lift as the sun came up behind the mountains. We need to figure out who had access to this location, Yarborough said. Start with the obvious. You, me, Driscoll, whoever was on the monitoring team. Then, work outward. The Marshal's Service transferred 6 witness cases to us when we took over the program, Whitcomb said. Landry was one of them. So, there are people from the Marshals who knew this location, too. Get me a list, everyone who's ever set foot in this house or had the coordinates in a file. I want to interview all of them. Whitcomb nodded and pulled out her phone to start making calls. Yarborough walked down the porch steps and looked out at the forest. Somewhere out there, Thomas Landry was either hiding or dead, and whoever had come for him, if anyone had come for him, had left no trace except impossible footprints and a house full of subtle wrongness. His phone buzzed. A text from Driscoll. "Need you back in Pittsburgh. We've got a problem." Yarborough texted back, "What kind of problem?" The response came immediately. Another witness just went dark. Different location, same pattern. No contact, satellite phone activated and turned off. Yarborough felt ice form in his stomach. One missing witness could be an isolated incident, a breakdown in protocol, or a panicked flight. But two missing witnesses following the same pattern. That was a breach. A systematic, deliberate breach of the witness protection system. He showed the message to Whitcomb. Her face went pale. "How is that possible?" she said. "These locations are compartmentalized. Even if someone compromised one, they shouldn't be able to find the others. Unless they have access at a higher level," Yarborough said. "Unless they're inside the system." They drove back to Pittsburgh in silence, both of them thinking about what it meant if the witness protection program had been infiltrated. How many lives were at risk? How many witnesses might have already been found and eliminated without anyone realizing? The FBI field office in Pittsburgh was in controlled chaos when they arrived. Agents were pulling files, making calls, trying to verify the status of every protected witness in their region. Driscoll met them in a conference room, looking like he hadn't slept. "Second witness is Gregory Portman," Driscoll said without preamble. "Former drug dealer who flipped on a trafficking organization 2 years ago. Been living in a safe house in rural Pennsylvania, about 200 miles from Landry's location. Same situation, satellite phone activated at 10:15 last night, no voice communication, just the distress beacon. Local agents found the house empty this morning." "Any signs of what happened?" Yarborough asked. "Prelim report says it's identical to Landry's place. House is clean, no forced entry, witnesses' belongings still there. But little things are off. Items moved, furniture rearranged slightly, and there are footprints outside that don't make sense, tracks that start and stop with no explanation." Whitcomb sat down heavily. "Someone's hunting them. Systematically." "That's what it looks like," Driscoll said. "But here's what I can't figure out. Both witnesses activated their satellite phones within half an hour of each other. Same night, same approximate time. What are the odds of that being coincidence?" "Zero," Yarborough said. "They were both compromised at the same time, coordinated. Which means someone has access to our entire system," Driscoll said. "Someone who can find multiple witnesses simultaneously and knows how to make them disappear without leaving evidence." The three of them looked at each other, the weight of that realization hanging between them. The witness protection program was supposed to be impenetrable. The last line of defense for people whose lives depended on secrecy. If it had been breached, if someone was inside the system, then everything they'd built was compromised. "We need to lock down every active witness," Yarborough said. "Move them to new locations, change all the protocols, and we need to find out who's leaking information." "Already started," Driscoll said. "But moving 40 witnesses without raising alarms is going to take time. And if whoever's doing this realizes we're on to them, they might accelerate their timeline." "What about local law enforcement?" Whitcomb asked. "Both safe houses are in rural areas. Have we checked with local deputies, see if they've noticed anything unusual?" Driscoll nodded. "There's a deputy in West Virginia who patrols near Landry's location. Name's Harlan Voss. I've got him coming in this afternoon to give a statement." Deputy Harlan Voss arrived at the field office at 3 o'clock that afternoon. He was a man in his early 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his life in the mountains. He wore his uniform neatly pressed, his badge polished, and he sat in the interview room with the careful stillness of someone who was used to waiting. Yarborough and Whitcomb interviewed him together, with Driscoll watching from behind the two-way mirror. "Deputy Voss," Yarborough began, "you patrol the area around the safe house where Thomas Landry was living. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks?" Voss thought about it carefully. "Define unusual. It's pretty quiet up there most of the time. Unfamiliar vehicles, strangers asking questions, anything that seemed out of place." "Well," Voss said slowly, "there was one thing. About a week ago, I saw a truck parked on the access road that leads to several properties up in that area. Just sitting there, no one inside. I ran the plates, came back to a rental company in Pittsburgh. I figured it was hunters or tourists, but when I came back a few hours later, the truck was gone." "Did you see who was driving it?" Whitcomb asked. "No, ma'am. Like I said, it was empty when I saw it." Yarborough made a note. "Anything else?" Voss hesitated. "There was something else, but it's probably nothing." "Tell us anyway." "I've been getting weird radio interference on my patrol route. Started about 2 weeks ago. Static, crackling, sometimes what sounds like voices, but I can never make out what they're saying. Happens in the same spots every time, near the ridgeline above your safe house." Yarborough and Whitcomb exchanged glances. "You think someone's monitoring radio traffic?" "Could be," Voss said. "Or it could just be atmospheric conditions. The mountains do strange things to radio signals sometimes." They talked with Voss for another 30 minutes, getting details about his patrol routes, the other properties in the area, any other unusual activity he'd observed. When he left, Yarborough felt like they had a few more pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the full picture. "The rental truck is a lead," Whitcomb said. "We should track it down, find out who rented it." "Already on it," Driscoll said, coming into the room. "Rental company is pulling records now. Should have a name by tonight." "What about Portman's location?" Yarborough asked. "Any reports of unusual activity there?" "Nothing yet, but I want you to drive out there tomorrow, take a look around. See if you can find anything the local agents missed." Yarborough nodded. The pieces were starting to come together, but slowly. Too slowly. Somewhere out there, 2 witnesses were missing, possibly dead. And whoever had taken them was still operating, still hunting. That night, Yarborough couldn't sleep. He lay in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the footprints that ended in the middle of the forest, about the items rearranged in the safe house, about the satellite phones that activated and went silent. Around 2 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Whitcomb. "The rental truck," she said without preamble. "We got the name. It was rented by someone using a fake ID, but the credit card traced back to a shell company. And when we dug deeper, we found something interesting." "What?" "The shell company was set up by a former FBI agent, someone who used to work in witness protection." Yarborough sat up. "Who?" "Name's Victor Merrick. He was with the program for 12 years before he retired in 2019, moved to West Virginia, bought property in the mountains. Property that's about 15 miles from Landry's safe house." "Jesus," Yarborough said. "We need to pick him up, now. Driscoll's already putting together a team. We're going out there at first light." Yarborough got dressed and met the team at the field office at 5 in the morning. They drove out to Merrick's property in a convoy of 3 vehicles, taking the winding mountain road slowly in the pre-dawn darkness. Merrick's place was at the end of a long dirt driveway, a large cabin set back in the woods. As they approached, Yarborough could see lights on inside, smoke coming from the chimney. They surrounded the property and approached with weapons drawn. Yarborough knocked on the door, calling out Merrick's name, identifying themselves as federal agents. The door opened almost immediately. Victor Merrick stood there in a bathrobe, looking sleepy and confused. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once but was now just tired. "Agents," Merrick said. "What's this about?" "We need to ask you some questions," Yarborough said. "About a rental truck and 2 missing witnesses." Merrick's expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about. Can we come in? Do you have a warrant?" Yarborough held up the paper. "We do." Merrick stepped aside and let them enter. The cabin's interior was neat, almost obsessively so. Books lined the walls, and a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. On a table near the window, Yarborough saw maps of the region spread out, marked with small red pins. "What are the maps for?" Whitcomb asked. "Hiking trails," Merrick said. "I like to explore the mountains." Yarborough walked over and looked at the maps more closely. The red pins marked locations scattered throughout the region, and when he checked the coordinates mentally, he realized with a chill that 2 of them corresponded exactly to the safe house locations where Landry and Portman had been living. "These pins," Yarborough said. "What do they represent?" Merrick looked at the maps, his expression unreadable. "Like I said, hiking trails, places I've been. Or places where witnesses are hidden," Whitcomb said. Merrick smiled slightly. "If you're asking me if I have knowledge of witness protection locations, the answer is yes. I worked in the program for 12 years. I know where a lot of safe houses are. That's not a crime. It is if you're using that knowledge to hunt those witnesses," Yarborough said. "Am I under arrest?" "Not yet." Merrick sat down in a leather armchair and folded his hands. "Then, unless you have evidence of a crime, I'd like you to leave my property." The forensic team spent the next 6 hours searching Merrick's cabin. They found the maps, found records of the rental truck, found a laptop with encrypted files, but they didn't find any direct evidence connecting Merrick to the missing witnesses. No weapons, no signs of violence, no indication that anyone besides Merrick had been at the property recently. It was frustrating and unsettling in equal measure. Merrick fit the profile perfectly. Former insider knowledge, proximity to the safe houses, clear signs of surveillance. But without hard evidence, they couldn't hold him. They brought him to Pittsburgh for questioning, but Merrick lawyered up immediately and refused to say anything more. After 48 hours, they had to let him go. Yarborough stood outside the field office and watched Merrick drive away, feeling like they'd just made a terrible mistake. "He's our guy," Whitcomb said beside him. "I know it." "Knowing and proving are 2 different things," Yarborough said. His phone buzzed. Another text from Driscoll. "Third witness just went dark. We have a serious problem. The 3rd missing witness was named Angela Mercer. She'd been living under protection in a farmhouse outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for the past 9 months after testifying against a human trafficking ring. Her handler had received the satellite phone ping at 11:23 p.m., the same pattern as the others. Brief activation, no voice communication, immediate disconnect." Yarborough and Whitcomb arrived at the farmhouse just after dawn. The property was surrounded by open fields, visible from the road, which made it different from the isolated mountain locations where Landry and Portman had been placed. This house had been chosen for the opposite reason. It was in plain sight, surrounded by neighbors who would notice if anything unusual happened. But something unusual had happened, and nobody had seen a thing. The local FBI agents who'd arrived first were waiting on the front porch. One of them, a young agent named Torres, walked over as Yarborough got out of the car. "Same as the others," Torres said. "No forced entry, no signs of struggle. Witness is gone, but all her belongings are here, including the go bag." That detail made Yarborough's chest tighten. In every other aspect of witness security, Angela Mercer had been meticulous. She'd followed every protocol, checked in on schedule, never drawn attention to herself. She would never have left without that bag unless she had no choice. Inside, the farmhouse was decorated in a plain, functional style. The furniture was generic, the walls bare except for a few landscape prints. Nothing personal, nothing that could identify the occupant. Standard WITSEC setup. But like the other locations, there were small things that felt wrong. In the kitchen, the dishes were arranged in the cabinet with the plates on the bottom shelf and the bowls on top, which was backwards from how most people organized things. In the living room, the television remote was sitting on the coffee table face down, its buttons against the wood. Whitcomb walked through the house slowly, cataloging each oddity. It's like someone was here and put everything back, but didn't quite remember how it was supposed to be. Or they're sending a message, Yarborough said. Same as Landry, making sure we know something's wrong. They searched the property thoroughly, looking for any signs of how Mercer had left or who might have taken her. In the barn behind the house, they found fresh tire tracks, but they led to and from the main road in a normal pattern, nothing suspicious. In the fields surrounding the property, there were no footprints, no disturbances in the grass. It was as if Angela Mercer had simply evaporated. The forensic team arrived an hour later, led again by Patricia Vaught. She'd been working around the clock on all 3 cases, and the strain was showing in her face. She examined the house with the same meticulous care she'd shown at the other locations, taking samples, dusting for prints, documenting every detail. "I'll tell you what I told you before," Vaught said to Yarborough as they stood in the kitchen. "This doesn't make physical sense. 3 people don't just disappear without leaving trace evidence. Even if they left voluntarily, even if they cleaned up after themselves, there would be something. Hair, skin cells, disturbed dust patterns. But these houses are clean, too clean." "What are you saying?" Yarborough asked. "I'm saying either we're dealing with someone who has professional-level knowledge of forensic countermeasures or there's something else going on that I can't explain." Yarborough's phone rang. It was Driscoll. "We've got a situation," Driscoll said without preamble. "Victor Merrick's cabin burned down last night. Total loss. By the time the fire department got there, it was just ash." Yarborough felt his stomach drop. Was Merrick inside? No, he wasn't there. Nobody knows where he is. His truck is gone, and he's not answering his phone. So he destroyed the evidence and ran. "Maybe," Driscoll said. "Or maybe someone else destroyed the evidence to make it look like he ran. Either way, we've issued a warrant for his arrest. Every law enforcement agency in the region is looking for him." After the call, Yarborough walked out to the porch and stood looking at the field stretching away toward distant tree lines. The morning sun was bright, the sky clear, but he felt a creeping sense of dread that had nothing to do with the weather. Whitcomb came out and stood beside him. 3 witnesses in 3 days. If there's a pattern, we need to find it fast. "The pattern is they're all going dark at night," Yarborough said, "between 9 p.m. and midnight, and they're all activating their satellite phones just before they disappear." "Like they know something's about to happen," Whitcomb said. "Like they're trying to warn us. But warn us about what? What are they seeing that makes them hit that panic button?" Neither of them had an answer. They spent the rest of the day interviewing Angela Mercer's neighbors, but nobody had seen anything unusual. No unfamiliar vehicles, no strangers asking questions, no sounds of disturbance in the night. It was as if the house had been surrounded by an invisible bubble that prevented anyone from noticing what was happening inside. That evening, they drove back to Pittsburgh for a briefing with Driscoll and the rest of the task force. The conference room was packed with agents, analysts, and coordinators from across the region. Everyone looked exhausted and worried. Driscoll stood at the front of the room, a map of the region projected on the screen behind him. 3 red dots marked the locations where witnesses had disappeared. "We've identified 15 active witnesses in this region who might be at risk," Driscoll said. "We're in the process of relocating all of them to new, secure locations, but it's taking time. We need to find out who's compromising these sites before we lose anyone else." "What about Merrick?" someone asked. "Still at large," Driscoll said. "But I'm not convinced he's working alone. The timing of these disappearances suggests coordination, multiple people moving simultaneously. One person couldn't cover that much ground that quickly." "What about the footprints?" Yarborough asked. "The ones that just stop. Has anyone figured out how that's possible?" A forensic analyst named Grayson stood up. "We've been analyzing the ground disturbance patterns. The tracks don't just stop, they fade. Like the weight pressing into the earth gradually decreased until there was no impression left, which is physically impossible unless the person was somehow getting lighter as they walked." A murmur went through the room. Nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. That the evidence didn't make sense because it couldn't make sense because something was happening that fell outside normal parameters of investigation. "There has to be a rational explanation," Driscoll said firmly. "Keep looking. Keep analyzing. We're missing something." After the briefing, Yarborough and Whitcomb went to a nearby diner to grab food. They sat in a booth near the back, pushing eggs and toast around their plates without much appetite. "You ever work a case like this before?" Yarborough asked. Whitcomb shook her head. "Nothing close. I've seen witnesses get found and killed, but it's always sloppy. Someone talks, information leaks, the witness makes a mistake. But this is different. This is surgical, precise. Like someone's been planning it for a long time," Yarborough said. His phone buzzed with a text. It was from Deputy Harlan Voss. "Need to talk. Found something near the Landry property. Can you meet me there tomorrow morning?" Yarborough texted back, "What did you find?" The response came a moment later. "Can't explain over text. You need to see it." The next morning, Yarborough and Whitcomb drove back into the West Virginia mountains. They met Deputy Voss at a turnoff about a mile from where Landry's safe house had been. Voss was standing next to his cruiser looking like he hadn't slept. "Deputy," Yarborough said as they got out, "what did you find?" Voss gestured toward the tree line. "Follow me. It's about a quarter-mile in." They hiked into the forest, following Voss along a deer trail that wound between the pines. The morning was cool and quiet, with mist still hanging in the low places between the trees. After about 15 minutes, Voss stopped and pointed. "There," he said. In a small clearing, barely visible through the undergrowth, was a structure. It looked like a hunting blind at first, but as they got closer, Yarborough realized it was something else. It was a platform built about 15 feet off the ground in a large oak tree, camouflaged with branches and leaves. On the platform was equipment: a telescope, a camera with a long lens, and what looked like radio monitoring gear. "I found it yesterday while I was tracking the property boundaries," Voss said. "Someone's been watching Landry's house from here, has a clear line of sight." Yarborough climbed up to the platform carefully. The equipment was expensive, professional grade. The camera's memory card was gone, but the telescope was still aligned, pointing directly toward where Landry's cabin sat in the valley below. The radio equipment was powered off, but when he turned it on, it immediately began picking up static and fragments of transmissions. "How long has this been here?" Whitcomb asked from the ground. "Hard to say," Voss called down. "But the wood's not weathered much. I'd guess a few months, maybe less." Yarborough examined the platform more carefully. In one corner, partially hidden under a tarp, he found a notebook. It was filled with entries, dated observations written in neat handwriting. He read through them, his sense of unease growing with each page. The entries detailed Thomas Landry's routine. what time he got up, when he made coffee, how often he checked the perimeter, what time he went to bed. Every detail of his day had been watched and recorded, and the entries went back 4 months. "Someone's been surveilling him since June," Yarborough said, "learning his patterns, documenting everything." But it was the last entry that made Yarborough's blood run cold. It was dated October 14th, the day before Landry disappeared, and it consisted of just 3 words: "Ready to move." He bagged the notebook as evidence and climbed down from the platform. "We need to search the areas around the other safe houses. If there's one surveillance post, there might be more." They spent the rest of the day coordinating search teams. By evening, they'd found 2 more platforms, one near Gregory Portman's location in Pennsylvania, and another near Angela Mercer's farmhouse. Each one was equipped with similar surveillance gear, and each one had a notebook filled with observations. The pattern was clear. Someone had been watching all 3 witnesses for months, studying them, waiting for the right moment to move. And then, on consecutive nights, all 3 had been taken. "It's a network," Driscoll said when they briefed him back in Pittsburgh. "Multiple people, multiple surveillance posts, coordinated action. This isn't one rogue agent. This is organized." "But organized by who?" Whitcomb asked. "And how did they get the locations?" "That's what we need to figure out," Driscoll said. "I want a complete audit of everyone who's had access to WITSEC files in the past year. Cross-reference with anyone who might have a motive to target these specific witnesses." The audit took 3 days and turned up disturbing results. 18 people had accessed files related to one or more of the missing witnesses in the past year. Most of them were cleared quickly, active agents with legitimate reasons for the access. But 3 names stood out as anomalies. The first was Victor Merrick, still at large, still the prime suspect. The second was a former Justice Department analyst named Rachel Gaines, who'd been fired 6 months ago for security violations. She'd been caught copying case files to a personal device and had left under a cloud of suspicion. The third name made everyone in the room go silent when it appeared on the screen. Sable Whitcomb. Yarborough stared at the display, not quite believing what he was seeing. "There has to be a mistake." "No mistake," the analyst running the audit said. Whitcomb accessed files for all 3 missing witnesses within 72 hours of their disappearances, outside her normal duty hours, from a remote terminal. Yarborough turned to look at Whitcomb, who'd gone pale. "Sable?" "I didn't access anything," Whitcomb said, her voice shaking. "I was home those nights. Someone's using my credentials." "When was the last time you changed your password?" Driscoll asked. I don't know. Maybe 3 months ago?" "Did you ever access the system from a personal device? Phone, laptop?" Whitcomb nodded slowly. "Sometimes, when I was working from home." Driscoll's expression was grim. "Your credentials were compromised. Someone's been impersonating you in the system." But the damage was done. Until they could verify Whitcomb's story, she was a suspect. Driscoll suspended her from the investigation and assigned her to administrative duty. 2 agents were assigned to monitor her movements. Yarborough watched them escort her out of the building, feeling like the ground was shifting under his feet. Whitcomb had been his partner on this case from the beginning. If she was involved, if she'd been feeding information to whoever was hunting these witnesses, then everything they'd done together was compromised. But he didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. He'd worked with Whitcomb long enough to trust his instincts, and his instincts said she was telling the truth. He spent the next 2 days tracking down Rachel Gaines, the fired analyst. She was living in Baltimore now, working as a paralegal for a private law firm. When Yarborough showed up at her apartment with a warrant, she let him in without resistance. "I knew someone would come eventually," Gaines said, sitting on her couch. She looked tired, resigned. I didn't do anything wrong, but nobody believes that. Your credentials were used to access witness protection files, Yarborough said. Multiple times. I know. I figured that out when I got fired. Someone hacked my accounts, used them to access files I'd never looked at. But the investigators didn't care. They just wanted someone to blame. Do you know who hacked you? Gaines shook her head. I've been trying to figure that out for months. Whoever did it was good. They covered their tracks, made it look like I was the one accessing the files. Why would someone target you specifically? Because I was easy, Gaines said. I made mistakes, used weak passwords, accessed the system from unsecured networks. I was a vulnerability, and someone exploited it. Yarborough believed her. The pattern was becoming clear. The hacker wasn't just targeting the witnesses themselves, but the infrastructure protecting them. They'd compromised credentials, used legitimate access to gather information, and then systematically hunted their targets. But that still didn't answer the biggest question. Who was behind it? The break came from an unexpected source. Deputy Harlan Voss called Yarborough late one night, his voice urgent. Agent Yarborough, I've been monitoring those radio frequencies I told you about. The interference near the surveillance posts, and I just picked up something you need to hear. What is it? A conversation. Two people talking on an encrypted channel. I couldn't decode it all, but I caught fragments. Names, locations, and one phrase that came through clear. Phase 2 begins tomorrow. Yarborough felt adrenaline spike through his system. Can you trace the signal? I'm trying. It's bouncing off repeaters, hard to pin down, but I think it's coming from somewhere in the mountains. Same general area as the surveillance posts. I'm on my way. Yarborough grabbed his gear and drove through the night, pushing the speed limit on the dark mountain roads. He met Voss at a ranger station near the Virginia border, where the deputy had set up his radio equipment. The signal's intermittent, Voss said, adjusting dials. But when it comes through, it's strong. Someone's broadcasting from close by. They spent the next hour triangulating the signal using Voss's equipment and the GPS in Yarborough's phone. The source seemed to be coming from a ridge about 5 miles to the west, in a remote area with no roads or marked trails. We'll have to hike in, Voss said, and it'll be dark. Then we better get started. They geared up and headed into the forest using night vision to navigate. The terrain was rough, steep slopes, and thick undergrowth that caught at their clothes and equipment. After 2 hours of climbing, they reached the ridge, and found something neither of them had expected. In a small valley on the far side of the ridge, hidden from any road or trail, was a compound. 3 buildings arranged in a triangle, connected by gravel paths. Generator-powered lights illuminated the area, and Yarborough could see people moving between the structures. "What is this?" Voss whispered. Yarborough pulled out binoculars and studied the compound. The buildings looked like they'd been there for years, but they'd been maintained carefully, camouflaged from aerial view with netting and natural vegetation. In the largest building, through a window, he could see computer equipment, multiple monitors, communications gear. This wasn't just a surveillance post, this was a command center. As they watched, a figure emerged from one of the buildings. Even at this distance, even in the uncertain light, Yarborough recognized him. Victor Merrick. But Merrick wasn't alone. 2 other people were with him, and as they moved into the light, Yarborough felt his heart sink. One of them was Rachel Gaines, the fired analyst. The other was someone Yarborough had never seen before. A tall man in dark clothing who moved with military precision. "We need backup," Yarborough said quietly. "A lot of it." But before he could reach for his radio, something happened that changed everything. The lights in the compound suddenly went out. all of them simultaneously plunging the valley into darkness. And in that darkness, Yarborough heard screaming, not from the compound, from somewhere else, somewhere closer. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the trees. Behind them, maybe 50 yards back along the trail they'd hiked, he could see movement. Figures in the darkness, moving fast, coming toward them. "Run," Yarborough said. They crashed through the forest, abandoning stealth for speed. The figures behind them were faster, gaining ground. Yarborough could hear footsteps, breaking branches, the sound of pursuit. They burst out onto a logging road and Voss pointed to the left. "My cruiser, 1/2 mile." They ran along the road, gasping for breath, the sounds of pursuit still behind them. Yarborough risked a glance back and saw 3 figures silhouetted against the trees, running with inhuman speed. They reached the cruiser and Voss fumbled with his keys. The doors unlocked and they threw themselves inside. Voss started the engine and floored it, tires spinning on the gravel. In the rearview mirror, Yarborough watched the 3 figures stop at the edge of the road, standing still, watching them drive away. And then, as they rounded a curve and lost sight of the road, the figures were gone. "What the hell was that?" Voss said, his voice shaking. Yarborough didn't answer. He was calling for backup, coordinating a response team, trying to explain what they'd found. But even as he talked, he couldn't shake the image of those figures moving through the darkness. Impossibly fast, impossibly coordinated, like they weren't quite human. The tactical team arrived at dawn, heavily armed and equipped for a siege. They surrounded the compound and moved in carefully, clearing each building one at a time. The compound was empty. No people, no equipment, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The buildings were clean, swept clear of evidence. Even the generator was gone, leaving only an oil stain on the ground where it had sat. "They knew we were coming," the tactical commander said. "Cleared out in less than 2 hours." Yarborough walked through the largest building, looking for anything they might have missed. In one corner, he found a single item left behind, a manila folder sitting on the floor as if placed there deliberately. Inside the folder was a list of names, 15 names, each with a location beside it. Yarborough's blood ran cold as he recognized them. Every active witness in the WITSEC program in the region. And 12 of the names had been crossed out. 3 were the witnesses who'd already disappeared. 9 others had been marked just the night before. "We need to get to these people," Yarborough said. "Right now." But as he said it, his phone rang. It was Driscoll. "We've got a problem," Driscoll said. 4 more witnesses just went dark, all at the same time. Different locations, but the same pattern. Satellite phones activated and shut off. Yarborough looked down at the list in his hand. 4 of the newly marked names. "They're accelerating," he said. "Whatever they're doing it faster." "We're evacuating everyone else," Driscoll said. "But I need you back here. We have to figure out what's really going on before we lose everyone." Yarborough took one last look at the empty compound, at the place where their suspects had been just hours ago. Then he climbed into the tactical vehicle for the ride back to Pittsburgh. On the drive, he couldn't stop thinking about those figures in the darkness, about the way they'd moved, the speed, the coordination, about the footprints that ended in the middle of the forest, the houses that felt wrong, the witnesses who vanished without trace. Something was happening that didn't fit the normal patterns of investigation. Something that made him question whether they were dealing with criminals at all or something else entirely. The FBI field office in Pittsburgh had become a fortress. Every remaining witness in the region had been relocated to the building itself, placed under armed guard in secure rooms on the upper floors. It was a desperate measure, breaking every protocol about keeping witnesses separated and locations compartmentalized. But with 7 people already missing and the threat accelerating, Driscoll had decided that concentration of security was better than distributed vulnerability. Yarborough sat in the operations center, watching security feeds from 16 different locations. The remaining witnesses were spread across 4 floors, each one monitored by cameras, each door guarded by armed agents. Nothing was getting in without being seen, but that didn't make him feel any safer. Whitcomb had been cleared after the IT forensics team confirmed her credentials had been cloned by sophisticated malware. The hack had occurred 3 months ago, when she'd opened what looked like a routine case file attachment. Since then, someone had been accessing the system as her, leaving digital footprints that implicated her while staying completely invisible themselves. She sat beside Yarborough now, looking exhausted and angry. "Who has that level of technical skill?" she asked. "That's not some amateur hacker. That's state-level capabilities. Or someone trained by state-level actors," Yarborough said. He was thinking about Victor Merrick, about his 12 years in witness protection. What kind of contacts had he made during that time? What kind of skills had he learned? Driscoll entered the operations center with Patricia Vaught and 2 other agents Yarborough didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as specialists from the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico. "We've been analyzing the pattern of disappearances," one of them said. Her name was Dr. Elena Frost, a psychologist who specialized in organized crime and cults. "And we think you're dealing with something more complex than a vendetta or a hit operation." "Explain," Driscoll said. "The surveillance posts, the coordinated timing, the careful staging of evidence in the safe houses, these all suggest ritualistic behavior. Someone isn't just killing these witnesses. They're taking them according to a specific plan, following a pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Yarborough asked Dr. Yund. Frost pulled up a map, showing the 7 disappearance locations. "Look at the geography. When you connect the points in chronological order, they form a shape. Not a random scatter pattern, but a deliberate geometric configuration." Yarborough stared at the map. She was right. The 7 points, when connected, formed something like an incomplete star or pentagram, with 2 points still missing to complete the shape. "How many more witnesses would they need to complete the pattern?" Whitcomb asked, her voice quiet. 2, Under Frost said. "Based on the geometry, we can predict approximately where those 2 locations would need to be." She highlighted 2 areas on the map. One somewhere in eastern Ohio, one in western Maryland. Yarborough checked the list of remaining witnesses. 2 of them had been relocated from addresses that fell within those predicted zones: Marcus Stillwell in Ohio and Jennifer Parr in Maryland. "They're both here now," Driscoll said. "Under guard. They're not going anywhere." "That might not matter," Dr. Frost said. "If this is ritualistic behavior, the geography might be symbolic rather than literal. The point isn't where the witnesses are taken from, but where they're taken to." A chill ran through the room. "You're saying they might try to take people from here," Whitcomb said, "from this building. It's possible. If completing the pattern is important to them, they won't stop just because the targets are protected." Driscoll stood up. "Then we double security. No one in or out without clearance. I want every access point monitored, every corridor patrolled, and I want those 2 witnesses moved to the most secure rooms we have." The night passed without incident, but nobody slept. Yarborough took shifts in the operations center, watching the monitors, drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago. On the screens he could see agents stationed at every checkpoint, every door, every stairwell. Around 3 in the morning, one of the monitors flickered. Just for a second, a brief distortion in the image, and then it was normal again. Yarborough sat up straighter. "Did you see that?" The technician monitoring the feeds nodded. Probably just a glitch. These systems had been running constantly for days. But Yarborough didn't think it was a glitch. He called down to the security desk on the floor where the flicker had occurred. "This is Yarborough. Do a visual check of all witnesses on floor 6. Eyes on every subject." The radio crackled. "Copy that. Checking now." 2 minutes later, the response came back. "All subjects accounted for. No problems." Yarborough relaxed slightly. Maybe it had been a glitch after all. But 10 minutes later, another monitor flickered. Different floor, different camera. This time, the distortion lasted longer. Maybe 3 seconds. When the image cleared, Yarborough could have sworn something in the hallway looked different, though he couldn't say exactly what. "Run diagnostics on the camera system," he ordered. The technician worked at his keyboard, bringing up system logs and status reports. Everything's showing normal, no faults, no interruptions in the feed. Then what's causing the flickers? I don't know. Yarborough called Whitcomb, who was supposed to be resting in one of the offices. She answered on the first ring, sounding wide awake. "What is it?" "The cameras are acting weird. Can you come down to the operations center?" "On my way." She arrived 5 minutes later, and they watched the monitors together. For almost an hour, nothing happened. The feeds remained steady, showing agents at their posts, witnesses in their rooms, empty corridors. Then, at 4:17 a.m., every camera in the building went dark simultaneously. The operations center erupted in controlled chaos. Technicians frantically tried to restore the feeds while agents grabbed weapons and rushed toward the stairwells. The backup power kicked in immediately, emergency lights illuminating the hallways with harsh red glows. "All units, report status," Driscoll's voice came over the radio. "Floor by floor. I want visual confirmation on every witness." The responses came back in order. Floors 2 through 5. All witnesses accounted for. All secure. Floor 6. All witnesses accounted for. Floor 7. Checking now. Then silence. "Floor 7, respond," Driscoll said. Nothing. "All units to floor 7, now." Yarborough and Whitcomb were already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time. They reached floor 7 and found the hallway in darkness except for emergency lighting. The 2 agents who had been stationed at the checkpoint were on the floor, unconscious but breathing. Their weapons were still holstered. "Medical to floor 7, Yarborough called into his radio, then to Whitcomb. "Check the witness rooms." They moved down the hallway, weapons drawn. The first room they checked was empty, the bed undisturbed. The second room held a witness who was asleep and unharmed, oblivious to the chaos. The third room was Marcus Stillwell's. The door was standing open. Inside, the room was empty. The bed was made. Marcus Stillwell's belongings were still there. His clothes in the closet, his book on the nightstand, his shoes by the door. But Stillwell himself was gone. And the window, which had been sealed and alarmed, was open. Cold air was blowing in from outside. Yarborough looked out the window. They were 7 floors up, and there was no fire escape, no ledge, no way to climb down. Just a straight drop to the parking lot below. "How is this possible?" Whitcomb said. The cameras came back online 30 seconds later. The technicians in the operations center reviewed the footage, but the gap in the recording was absolute. For exactly 11 minutes, every camera in the building had captured nothing but static. No images, no sound, just electronic noise. The 2 agents who'd been knocked unconscious couldn't explain what had happened. One moment they were standing at their post. The next, they were waking up on the floor with paramedics standing over them. No memory of being attacked, no awareness of anyone approaching. Just a blank space where 11 minutes should have been. Medical examination showed no signs of trauma, no drugs in their system, no explanation for their sudden unconsciousness. Marcus Stillwell was simply gone. Driscoll ordered a complete lockdown of the building and a floor-by-floor search. Every room, every closet, every utility space was checked. But Stillwell wasn't found. Somehow, impossibly, he'd been taken from a secure room on the 7th floor of a locked-down federal building surrounded by armed agents. As dawn broke over Pittsburgh, Yarborough stood in the parking lot looking up at the open window. A forensic team was still processing Stillwell's room, but he knew they wouldn't find anything. Just like all the other locations, just like all the other disappearances, there would be no evidence, no traces, nothing to explain what had happened. Whitcomb came out of the building and stood beside him. "Patricia found something," she said quietly. "What?" "In Stillwell's room, on the wall behind where the bed was. Someone had written something in pencil, very faint. You'd only see it if you moved the bed." "What did it say?" "They're already inside." Yarborough felt his skin crawl. "When was that written?" "Patricia thinks within the last few hours. The graphite marks are fresh." So Stillwell knew something was going to happen. He was trying to warn us. Or whoever took him left it as a message, Whitcomb said. They went back inside and examined the message themselves. It was written in a shaky hand, barely legible, pressed hard into the wall. Yarborough had the room sealed and photographed from every angle. As they worked, Deputy Harlan Voss called, "Agent Yarborough, I've been monitoring those radio frequencies again, the encrypted channel. It just went active again, and this time I'm picking up clear transmissions. Can you understand what they're saying?" "Not most of it, but I heard one phrase repeated multiple times. 8 down, 1 to go. 8. 7 witnesses plus Marcus Stillwell." Which meant Jennifer Parr, the witness from Maryland who was still in the building, was the final target. Yarborough ran to the operations center. "Where's Parr?" "Floor 4, room 412, the technician said. "Visual confirmation 2 minutes ago. She's secure. I want eyes on her constantly. No breaks, no gaps. If those cameras flicker again, I want agents in that room immediately." They set up a dedicated monitor, showing only Jennifer Parr's room. She was a woman in her mid-30s, small and nervous-looking, sitting on her bed and reading a magazine. 2 armed agents were posted directly outside her door, and 4 more were stationed at the floor's checkpoints. "Nothing's getting to her," Driscoll said, but he didn't sound convinced. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Every hour, they rotated agents, made sure everyone stayed alert. The camera feeds remained stable. Jennifer Parr stayed in her room, occasionally pacing, sometimes lying down, but always visible on the monitor. Dr. Frost from the Behavioral Analysis Unit studied the geometric pattern on the map again. "If they take her," she said, "if they complete the pattern, what happens then?" "What do you mean?" Yarborough asked. "This kind of ritualistic behavior usually has an end goal, a purpose. They're not just collecting people randomly. They're building towards something. Like what? I don't know. But whatever it is, it's big enough to justify this level of planning and risk." As evening fell, Yarborough felt exhaustion pulling at him. He'd been awake for almost 40 hours, running on adrenaline and coffee. But he couldn't rest, couldn't let his guard down. Not when they were so close to either stopping this or losing everyone. At 9:30 p.m., exactly the time when previous witnesses had activated their satellite phones, Jennifer Parr suddenly sat up in her bed. On the monitor, they watched her turn her head, as if hearing something. Then she stood up and walked to the door. "What's she doing?" Whitcomb said. Parr Sisnagsor knocked on her door from the inside. The 2 agents opened it, and she said something to them. One of them spoke into his radio. "Agent Parr says she needs to use the bathroom," came the report. "She's asking if someone can escort her." That room has a bathroom, Yarborough said. Why would she need to leave? She says the plumbing's not working, says it's been backed up all day. Yarborough checked the maintenance logs. No reports of plumbing issues on floor 4. Tell her to stay in her room. We'll send someone to check the plumbing. But on the monitor, Jennifer Parr was becoming agitated. She was arguing with the agents, her body language showing distress. Then, suddenly, she pushed past them and started walking down the hallway. "Stop her!" Yarborough ordered. The agents moved to intercept her, but Parr was fast. She dodged around them and ran toward the stairwell. More agents converged on her position, cutting off her escape routes. They cornered her at the elevator bank. She was crying now, backing against the wall, looking terrified. "I have to go," she kept saying. "I have to go. They're calling me." "Who's calling you?" one of the agents asked. "I don't know, but I have to go to them. I have to." They restrained her carefully and brought her back to her room. A doctor was called to sedate her, to calm her down. As they administered the medication, Parr kept crying, kept saying she had to leave, that they were waiting for her. "What's happening to her?" Whitcomb asked. Dr. Frost watched the monitor with a troubled expression. "It looks like some kind of compulsion, like she's being pulled towards something against her will." The sedative finally took effect, and Jennifer Parr collapsed onto her bed, unconscious. They moved her to a different room, one with no windows and only a single reinforced door. 6 agents were posted outside. "She's not going anywhere," Driscoll said. "Not like this." But Yarborough wasn't so sure. He'd seen too many impossible things in the past week to believe that any security measure was foolproof. At midnight, the cameras flickered again. This time, Yarborough was ready. "All agents to floor 4. Immediate visual on Parr's room." The flicker lasted only a second, but when the image cleared, something was different. Yarborough couldn't say what at first, just that the hallway looked wrong somehow. The agents reached Parr's room and confirmed she was still inside, still sedated, still secure. But they reported something odd. The temperature in the hallway had dropped significantly. Their breath was visible in the air, condensing into fog. "That's not possible," the building engineer said when Yarborough called him. "The HVAC system doesn't work that way. We can't make one hallway that cold without affecting the entire floor." But the temperature kept dropping. Within minutes, ice was forming on the walls of the corridor. The agents posted outside Parr's room were shivering, their uniforms inadequate for the sudden cold. "Get them out of there," Yarborough ordered. "Pull them back to the checkpoint." As the agents retreated, the lights on floor 4 began to flicker. Not the cameras this time, but the actual lights in the hallway. On and off, creating a strobe effect that made it hard to see clearly. And in those flashes of darkness between the lights, Yarborough could see movement on the monitors. Shapes in the hallway, figures that appeared and disappeared with each flicker. They were tall, impossibly thin, moving with fluid grace toward Jennifer Parr's room. "Send tactical," Driscoll said, his voice tight. "Full response, now." But the tactical team was still 2 floors away when the lights went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing floor 4 in red. On the monitors, they watched the figures reach Parr's door. One of them, it was hard to tell through the interference and poor lighting, seemed to pass through the door without opening it. The tactical team burst onto floor 4 30 seconds later. They cleared the hallway, finding it empty and impossibly cold. The door to Parr's room was still locked, still secure. But when they opened it, Jennifer Parr was gone. The bed was empty. Her belongings were still there. The window, which had been sealed and covered, was open, letting in frigid air from outside, and on the wall, written in frost that was already melting, were the words, "Complete." Yarborough stood in the empty room, feeling the cold seep into his bones. 9 witnesses. 9 people who had been under federal protection, supposedly safe, supposedly secure. All gone without a trace. He walked to the window and looked out. 8 floors down, the parking lot was empty and dark. No way anyone could have climbed down. No way anyone could have survived the fall. But the window was open, and Jennifer Parr was gone. Patricia Vaught arrived an hour later to process the scene. She worked in silence, collecting samples of the frost, documenting the temperature anomalies, analyzing the door lock to confirm it hadn't been tampered with. Finally, she stood up and looked at Yarborough. "I can't explain this, any of this. The physics doesn't work. The evidence doesn't make sense. It's like we're investigating something that violates the fundamental laws of how the world operates." "What are you saying?" Yarborough asked, though he already knew. "I'm saying that either we're missing something huge, or we're dealing with something that's beyond my ability to analyze. Something that isn't normal." That night, unable to sleep, Yarborough went back to the operations center and pulled up all the footage from the past week. He watched the flickering cameras, the empty rooms, the witnesses who'd vanished. He studied the geometric pattern on the map, the 9 points forming a shape he didn't recognize, but that felt significant somehow. And he thought about the figures he'd seen in the mountains, moving impossibly fast through the darkness. The footprints that ended in the middle of the forest. The houses where items had been rearranged in ways that made no sense. The cold that shouldn't exist. The walls that figures passed through. Whitcomb found him there at dawn, surrounded by printouts and maps and case files. "You should sleep," she said. "I can't, not until I understand what's happening." "Maybe we're not supposed to understand," Whitcomb said quietly. "Maybe that's the point." Yarborough looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Dr. Frost said this was ritualistic, that it was building towards something. Well, they've completed it now. 9 witnesses, arranged in a specific pattern. So, what happens next?" As if in answer to her question, Yarborough's phone rang. It was Harlan Voss. "Agent Yarborough," Voss said, his voice shaking. "I'm at one of the surveillance posts, the one near Landry's old safe house. You need to see this." "What is it?" "Just get here, now." They drove to West Virginia, making the trip in record time. Voss met them on the trail leading to the surveillance platform, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "I came up here to check the equipment," Voss said. "Wanted to see if there were any clues we'd missed, and I found something." He led them to the platform. Someone had been there recently. The surveillance equipment had been moved, rearranged, and in the center of the platform, drawn in chalk, was a symbol. The same geometric shape that the 9 disappearance locations formed on the map. But this version was complete. All 9 points connected, forming a pattern that hurt to look at, that seemed to shift and change when you tried to focus on it. And beneath the symbol, written in the same chalk, was a message. "The door is open. Thank you for your cooperation." Yarborough stared at the words, trying to understand what they meant. "Thank you for cooperation." As if the FBI's attempts to protect the witnesses, to secure them, to gather them together, had somehow been exactly what the hunters wanted. "We helped them," Whitcomb said, her voice barely a whisper. "By bringing everyone to one location, by concentrating them, we made it easier. We did exactly what they needed us to do." Yarborough felt sick. She was right. Every decision they'd made, every security measure they'd implemented had played into the pattern. They'd been manipulated from the beginning, guided by an intelligence they'd never even recognized was there. But why? He said. What was the point? What did they accomplish by taking these specific 9 people? Voss pointed to something else on the platform. A notebook, similar to the surveillance logs they'd found before. But this one was different. The entries were in a different handwriting, more recent. Yarborough picked it up and read the first page. What he found there made his blood run cold. The notebook contained profiles of the 9 witnesses. Not just their routines and habits, but their backgrounds, their histories, their crimes. And as Yarborough read through them, he began to see a pattern he hadn't noticed before. All 9 witnesses had testified against organized crime operations. But not just any operations. Each one had been involved in cases connected to human trafficking, specifically the trafficking of women and children. They weren't random targets, Yarborough said. They were chosen specifically because of what they'd testified about. But why take them? Whitcomb asked. Why not just kill them? Yarborough turned to the last page of the notebook. There was a single sentence written there in careful block letters. They go to pay the debt. What debt? Voss asked. None of them had an answer. They took the notebook back to Pittsburgh as evidence, but Yarborough knew it wouldn't help them find the missing witnesses. The pattern was complete. The ritual, or whatever it had been, was finished. And the 9 people who'd been taken were beyond any help the FBI could provide now. The case officially remained open, classified as 9 simultaneous abductions with suspected involvement of a domestic terrorist organization. Victor Merrick, Rachel Gaines, and the unidentified man from the compound were all placed on the FBI's most wanted list. But no arrests were ever made. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses ever came forward with information. The surveillance posts in the mountains were dismantled and analyzed, but they revealed nothing that explained what had really happened. The command center that Yarborough and Voss had seen was never found again, as if it had simply vanished along with the people who'd operated it. And sometimes, late at night, Yarborough would wake up remembering those figures in the darkness, moving impossibly fast, and he would wonder if they'd been hunting the witnesses at all, or if something else had been calling those 9 people. Something that had used the FBI's own protective instincts against them. Something that had needed specific individuals, arranged in a specific pattern, for a purpose that remained hidden. The geometric symbol drawn in chalk on that platform haunted his dreams. He never figured out what it meant, never understood the significance of the arrangement, but sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could see it clearly, shifting and changing, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost alive. And he would wonder what door had been opened, and what had come through it. 6 months after the last witness disappeared, Quentin Yarborough received a package at his home. No return address, postmarked from a town in West Virginia he'd never heard of. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. The note read, "You deserve to know what you helped accomplish." Yarborough took the drive to the field office and had it scanned by the IT security team. Clean of malware, they said, but encrypted. It took them 3 days to crack the encryption. The drive contained video files, 9 of them. Yarborough watched them alone in a secure viewing room, with Whitcomb and Driscoll behind the glass. The first video showed Thomas Landry, the first witness to disappear. He was alive, standing in what looked like a cave or underground chamber. Stone walls, dim lighting, symbols carved into the rock that matched the geometric pattern they'd found. Landry was speaking, but not in English. The language was unfamiliar, guttural, and strange. His eyes were unfocused, distant, as if he was in a trance. Behind him, figures moved in the shadows, tall, thin shapes that the camera couldn't quite capture clearly. The video lasted 2 minutes. At the end, Landry walked toward the darkness at the back of the chamber and disappeared into it. The video cut to black. The other 8 videos were similar, each missing witness, alive and speaking that unknown language, walking into the darkness. Some looked terrified. Others seemed peaceful, accepting. Jennifer Parr was crying but continued forward anyway, as if pulled by invisible strings. After the 9th video ended, there was one more file. A text document, single page. It read, "The 9 have been given. The old debts are settled. What was taken from us has been returned. Do not look for them. They exist in a place your laws cannot reach, serving a purpose your minds cannot comprehend. Your protection failed because it was meant to fail. We needed them gathered, concentrated, purified by your own fear for their safety. Thank you for being exactly what we needed you to be." Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. Some prices, once paid, change the world forever. You played your part well, Agent Yarborough. Sleep soundly, knowing you helped restore balance. The keepers, Yarborough sat in silence after reading it, the weight of those words settling over him like a shroud. They'd been used, manipulated. Every attempt to protect the witnesses had been anticipated, guided, shaped into exactly what the keepers needed. "We have to find them," Whitcomb said through the intercom. "We have to bring them back." But Yarborough knew the truth, even if he couldn't say it out loud. The 9 witnesses weren't coming back. Whatever had been done to them, wherever they'd been taken, was beyond the reach of any federal investigation. He thought about those figures in the forest, moving impossibly fast. The footprints that ended in nothing, the cold that shouldn't exist, the symbols that hurt to look at. All of it had been real, and all of it pointed to something operating outside the normal rules of reality. The case was officially closed 3 months later, classified and sealed. The official report stated that 9 witnesses had been abducted and murdered by a sophisticated criminal organization with inside access to witness protection protocols. Victor Merrick and Rachel Gaines remained fugitives, wanted for conspiracy and multiple counts of kidnapping. But there was an addendum to the file, sealed under a higher classification, available only to senior officials with specific clearance. That addendum contained the videos, the geometric patterns, and a recommendation that future witness protection protocols be revised to prevent concentration of protected individuals in single locations. The addendum ended with a note from Yarborough himself. This investigation revealed patterns of activity that suggest organized ritual behavior with unclear motives and unexplained technical capabilities. Conventional criminal analysis may be insufficient. Recommend continued monitoring for similar pattern formations in future cases. He never wrote what he really believed, that they'd encountered something pretending to be human, something that had hunted 9 specific people for reasons that had nothing to do with crime or revenge. Something that needed those particular individuals, arranged in that particular pattern, to open a door that should have stayed closed. Deputy Harlan Voss called him one night, months after the case had been sealed. "I'm still monitoring those frequencies," Voss said. "The radio channels. They've gone quiet mostly, but sometimes, late at night, I pick up something. It sounds like voices, but they're speaking that same language from the videos. And underneath it all there's a sound, like breathing, but huge, like something massive is sleeping somewhere in these mountains." "You should stop listening," Yarborough said. "I know, but I can't, because sometimes, Agent Yarborough, I swear I hear them, the witnesses, calling out, not for help, more like they're calling others, inviting them to come join them." Yarborough didn't sleep well that night, or many nights after. He requested a transfer 6 months later, moving to the white-collar crime division in New York, as far from the Appalachian Mountains as he could get while staying on the East Coast. But distance didn't help. He still dreamed about the geometric pattern, still saw those figures moving through the darkness, still heard Jennifer Parr's voice saying they're calling me in that terrified whisper. 2 years after the disappearances, a hiker found a campsite in the West Virginia mountains, abandoned but recently used. The rangers who investigated found 9 sleeping bags arranged in a circle, 9 backpacks, 9 sets of personal items. DNA testing matched all 9 to the missing witnesses. But there was something else at the campsite. A journal written in multiple hands, dated entries covering the 2 years since the disappearances. The entries described a community, a purpose, a service being performed. They spoke of the old ways, the old powers, the balance that needed maintaining. The final entry, dated just days before the campsite was discovered, read, "We have learned what we needed to learn. We understand now why we were chosen. The work continues, but not here. We move deeper, where the roots are strongest. If anyone finds this, know that we went willingly in the end. What we left behind was small compared to what we found. Tell them we're not lost. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." The journal was added to the classified file, but no further investigation was launched. The case remained closed. The 9 people remained missing, presumed dead by most, though no death certificates were ever issued. Yarborough retired from the FBI in 2029, taking a position teaching criminal justice at a small college in Vermont. He never talked about the Whitsec breach case, never discussed what he'd seen or what he believed had really happened. But sometimes, late at night in his office, he would pull out copies of the case files, unofficial copies he'd kept despite regulations, and study the geometric pattern. He'd mapped it against astronomical charts, against ancient symbols, against mathematical formulas, trying to understand what it meant, what it opened, what had come through. He never found an answer, but he noticed something disturbing. Similar patterns were appearing in other cases, not FBI cases, but reports from around the world. People going missing in groups, arranged in specific locations, all with histories of testifying against human trafficking operations. 9 people here, 9 people there, always 9, always arranged in that same geometric configuration. It was happening again, somewhere else, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. One night, 10 years after the original disappearances, Yarborough received an email. No sender information, routed through anonymous servers. The message was brief. The door you helped open remains open. New volunteers are always welcome. When you're ready to understand, follow the pattern. We'll be waiting. Attached was a map. 9 locations marked in rural Vermont, forming the familiar geometric shape. And one of those locations was less than 5 miles from Yarborough's home. He deleted the email immediately, then reformatted his hard drive to be sure it was gone. But he couldn't delete it from his memory. Couldn't stop himself from checking the news, watching for reports of missing people in those areas. For 3 months, nothing happened. Then, a graduate student from his college disappeared. She'd been researching historical trafficking cases in New England. Her last known location was a hiking trail that passed through one of the marked coordinates. Yarborough didn't report what he knew, didn't share the email or the map, because he understood, finally, what the keepers had been trying to tell him from the beginning. This was bigger than any one investigation, bigger than the FBI, bigger than any institution designed to enforce human laws. Some doors, once opened, stayed open, and some patterns, once recognized, couldn't be unseen. He moved away from Vermont the following month, resigning his teaching position, selling his house, disappearing into retirement somewhere the FBI couldn't easily track him. Because he knew that if the keepers wanted him, they would find him. And he knew that despite everything he'd learned, everything he'd seen, he still didn't understand what they really wanted. The 9 witnesses from the original case were never found. The classification on the file was upgraded twice, until only a handful of people in the entire government had access to it. The videos, the journal, the radio transmissions, all of it locked away, studied by specialists who provided no answers, only more questions. And somewhere in the mountains, in caves that don't appear on any map, in chambers carved with the symbols that predate recorded history, the work continues. People go missing, always in groups of 9, always connected to the same crimes, always arranged in the same pattern. The FBI investigates, follows leads, builds cases, and accomplishes exactly what the keepers need them to accomplish. Because some hunters aren't hunting at all. They're harvesting. And the crop is always ready when the pattern is complete. Sable Whitcomb still works for the FBI, now a senior coordinator in witness protection. She's implemented new protocols, new security measures, new ways of distributing and hiding protected witnesses. Everything designed to prevent another breach. But late at night, when she reviews the active cases, she sometimes sees patterns forming. 9 witnesses in the same region, all connected to human trafficking cases. And she has to decide, does she move them, scatter them, break the pattern before it completes, or would moving them be exactly what the keepers expect her to do? Would it push the pieces into place, complete the configuration, open another door? She doesn't know. Can't know. And that uncertainty haunts her more than any specific memory from the original case. Because the worst part isn't what happened to those 9 people. The worst part is not knowing if it's about to happen again, and not knowing if, by trying to prevent it, she's actually causing it. The pattern is always there, waiting to be completed. And someone, somewhere, is always watching, always guiding, always harvesting. The door stays open, and what comes through it is patient, ancient, and hungry for the debts that humanity owes.